Welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm here with Daniel Garner, who's one half of O.G. Rose. He's also the author of The Conflict of Mind and Thoughts. And today we're here to discuss his next book, which is just released, called Belonging Again, Part 1, An Explanation. So Daniel, welcome back to the channel. Longtime friend of the channel. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, Cadell. I always enjoy a chance to speak with you. Thank you for reading the book. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the book. And it's really a pleasure to be here today, Cadell. And congratulations to you on going through the science of logic in such a tremendous way in the future classes that are coming up with the Divine Theory Underground on Zupancha that you've started, and also looking ahead to Lacan on the Acri. So just marvelous work, Cadell.
Fantastic. All right. So we have a nice point of contact here because not only did you attend or rather watch a lot of the Science of Logic lectures, but you were also a teacher in the Science of Logic course. And I feel like there's many dimensions of that text and the course that we tried to bring to life that connect with Belonging Again in a meaningful way. And so I'm just interested to see the way our thought intersects here at both the intersection of the course and the intersection of your new book. The first question I want to raise, or the first point I'd like to highlight in regards to Belonging Again, is kind of a meta-structural question about the book as a whole. So I took when I was first going through the book, I wanted to sort of look at what structure's going on here and maybe what logic was unfolding here in the book. And I want to tell you the way I was interpreting the structure of the book, and then you can tell me insofar as that's correct or insofar as you have a different intention. So it seemed to me like there's three parts of the book, where there's a first part of the book with many small chapters or smaller divisions. And then there's a second part, which is almost like the major thematic point, which is the second part titled Confusion's Masterpiece, or Belonging Again, Confusion's Masterpiece, which is a very long and comprises, seems, the majority of the book. And then a final third section, which is just a short conclusion, which seems to me to just be pointing towards part two. So is that the meta structure at work, and if so, what's the logic behind going with that structure?
I think that's a magnificent description of the meta structure. Very excellent. I'll always tell people the way that I kind of like to write books is, instead of essay collections, I call them essay books. Meaning that you have like a bunch of those little chapters that each has hopefully a kernel of an idea that connects with the other kernels of ideas, that then you can kind of see how they all fit together. And then that leads up to Belonging Again. And a lot of those opening sections. So for example, the first one is the introduction, talking about running into Philip Rieff, Triumph of the Therapeutic, back in 2016, why I think the language is better when we talk about givens and releases, not constraints and releases. I was speaking with Michelle about this as well, and have mentioned it. I think, unfortunately, that makes Rieff too conservative, and also makes it more difficult to connect Rieff with thinkers like Hannah Arden's Banality of Evil, and also makes it more difficult to have his work fit into what he calls for at the end of Triumph of the Therapeutic, which is a psycho-historical explanation of the movement of the subject through time and how we got to this present moment. So it talks about that. Then we'll talk about the legitimization crisis, which is a reference to Habermas. Then playing off James Wood, Trance of Believability, because I actually think studying the way we experience fiction actually is a good way to understand how we experience society when society is functional. So the phenomenology of reading and the phenomenology of being in a society and a culture go together. Then there's stuff as well that once you get rid of sociological givens, and givens are the way that James Hunter will talk about it, is the background. It's kind of thoughtless background according to which you operate. And because it's thoughtless, it's not existentially overwhelming. It can just guide you. So for example, if 200 years ago you were born in America, you were probably Christian. Christian was something given, axiomatic almost, mathematical. It was just the assumption it was assumed, and therefore became the background upon which you made decisions. But you didn't think about the ground itself, right? Now, this made it easier to have belonging, to feel like you were part of a community, and so on and so forth, but it ran the risk of course, oppression, the banality of evil, which is talked about a lot in the book, which is when evil becomes everyday. So it becomes given that whites are better than blacks, for example. It becomes given that men are superior to women. You don't question it, right? Well, that's a problem then. It gives you belonging, but that very structure that you're finding belonging in is one that's oppressive, right? So then for good reason, you deconstruct givens, and that's going to lead to equality. There's a paper in there called Equality and Its Immoral Limits, how we always defined equality relative to our ethical structures, and how if you have an immoral equality, you have to change the background. But of course, if you do that, then you also make everyone way more existential, right? Because they don't have the givens anymore to direct themselves. So as the papers talk about those various situations, the first half, and that's also going to allude to the problems of autonomous rationality, which we've talked about so many different times. But then, of course, there's the problems of autonomous non-rationality, which is givens that you don't question. That then leads into the main essay of belonging again, which is basically going to be really, really explaining why we need to think these tragic sociologists. In the same way that I think, as you know, I think the modern counter-enlightenment and counter-enlightenment thinkers, and of course, Hegel's science of logic has basically been not thought or overlooked. There's a way, and thus philosophy seems to have died in favor of just Peter Singer moral hypothetical situations and neo-pragmatism of Richard Rorty. Of course, all of those have a seat at the table, but it always becomes problematic when that's all philosophy is, in the same way that rationality is of the utmost importance. I think people sometimes may hear me and think I'm anti-rationality. No, it's always dialectical. The issue is autonomous anything. Autonomous, well, like autonomous rationality, autonomous non-rationality, autonomous economics. When you think about economics outside of all the other disciplines, then you get a lot of trouble. So the issue is, like, once you take seriously that there's a problem with autonomous rationality and an autonomous non-rationality, and the book's going to talk about givens and releases, and I'll give it back to you. Well, then we're talking a dialectic. Oh, well, dialectics, one, you can't solve them. All you can ever do is manage them. And what does that look like if you take that seriously? What does society look like if you take that seriously? And the book is going to basically also argue, because we have not taken that seriously, you have all sorts of social pathologies. It's going to talk about, like, obviously Trump. It's going to talk about Brexit, all these like things where all the experts were shocked. How in the world did this occur? Well, one of the reasons is because we haven't taken culture seriously. We haven't taken people's beliefs seriously. We've treated them simply as economic units that follow incentives. So if they're economically happy, everything's great. Well, it turns out that culture matters to people. In fact, without culture, they tend to be existentially overwhelmed, because culture tends to, now we have to go into what that term means, of course, but culture, generally speaking, historically, was what resulted from givens, the directions in which people could find belonging. And if you take that away from them, they don't tend to be very happy. You know, if you attack, I've heard it said, maybe it was Hunter who said, if you attack a person's story, they don't tend to be very happy about that. They tend to rebel, right? Well, in order to deal with those problems, though, that would mean you have to take seriously the dialectic of society, which we're not even ready to think, basically. I don't think we're even ready to think that. Because that gets you into all of the difficult subjects like economics, sexuality. I know you're doing that tremendous work with Dave. I also want to make a comment. I read that article that he put out on Mikey's reading and Dave's reading. That was such a good essay on theory underwear. I really like that. But anyway, we have to think those things. And if we don't think those things, then we're in huge trouble. And then, of course, the third part of this, as you talk about, is pointing ahead, where basically a lot of this is going to come down to making the subject central, thinking the subjects. The book is going to allude to the absolute no in Hegel. It's going to talk about the Nietzschean child. It's going to talk about the Deleuzian individual. It's going to talk about Jesus we see in Dostoevsky. And those are going to kind of be the four possible ways of thinking about the subject that then you have to get into part two on. Which, can you have a Deleuzian economics? If not, then you might have to have a Hegelian economics. Well, what does that look like? Is that just Marxism? Why or why not? Well, then we have to go through all of that. And dividing the book up into explain and address, as you know, I'll talk about explain versus address. That was just a good way for me to divide the book up so that you have these two different sections, because once you get into address, then you're talking about, okay, which one of these philosophical paradigms is the ones by which has the highest likelihood of operating in a manner that's non-pathological or not ending up in, say, radical segregation between nation states or different things. Because you can solve all this simply by removing interconnectivity. Well, that's just running from relations, right? Oh, is that what you want? Yes, no, why, or why not? So the metastructure you outlined is very well put. I appreciate that very much.
All right, I'm glad I got a sense of that structure, and I mean, you're bringing up many points there that I think do capture, even though there's so much discussed and it's coming from so many different angles. I do think that focusing on the givens and the releases is something that brings a sort of dialectical continuity throughout the book as a whole. And so when people read the book for themselves, I would just encourage them to keep that grounding in their mind and that tension that you're trying to explore throughout the book as something that's seems fundamental to your argument. And moving on to specifically focusing on that this is part one of a two-part larger project, keeping that in mind throughout our discussion, and that this part one is focusing on an explanation as opposed to an address. What I would like to first ask is, as it regards to the explanation, how should we interpret the explanation on the level of the local, the national, and the global? So in regards, and also in relationship to I guess to you as an author and as a man. First, is this grounded first and foremost in the local? Is this grounded first and foremost in the United States of America or the West, and what extent does this help us with the global?
That's a tremendous question. Excellent. A lot of these thinkers are going to be speaking out of American universities. They're going to be very Western focused and things like that. But I would also argue that as globalization and modern capitalism comes to define more and more areas of the world, a lot of the concerns apply everywhere, basically. And actually, frankly, there's a whole lot in the second book on Dugin, because Dugin is one of the responses to denying, say, we're not going to fall into what is called neoliberalism. Now, I know that's a problematic term that means a lot of things to a lot of people. But if we take neoliberalism, meaning the Washington consensus, which is basically which I think is a valid thing, that is real. And if that's what neoliberalism means, then it's perfectly fine. Now, people like Dietrich McCloskey defend neoliberalism where it's not always an insult. And I agree, we shouldn't ever take a phrase. Like, one of the reasons we have trouble talking about anything is because for conservatives, the word communism is an insult. The moment you say it, it's off the table. Well, for a lot of people, when you say neoliberal, it's off the table because that's bad. So that's not what I'm trying to do. And basically, if we take the tragic sociologist seriously, which leads into tragic economics, you're going to have problems with like capitalism, communism, whatever you talk about is going to be a problem management scenario, not problem solutions. There are conditions in which capitalism works remarkably well. Unfortunately, those conditions are not guaranteed if the subject doesn't hold themselves together. There are conditions in which something more like socialism and communism work very well, but there's no guarantee that those conditions are maintained. And actually, the reason there's no guarantee they're maintained tends to be because of the very division between the local, the state, and the national and the global, because they're lost in translation along the stack, basically. What works really well on the local, for example, can be isolationism. You can, like, for example, if you just treat, your local community as red state, all conservative, and those liberals out there are out to get us, you can find belonging because everyone has a shared intelligibility of how the world works. You can find meaning in that because everyone appreciates the work that you do that fits into that conservative model. You're going to work, you're taking care of your family, and therefore you have meaning and belonging. And it's really important in the book. There's a distinction between meaning and belonging. And actually, I think we get into trouble when we conflate those categories. They can overlap. But belonging will not necessarily do the work of meaning, and meaning will not necessarily do the work of belonging. But it's tempting to think that they are the same thing when faced with Confucian's masterpiece, and where realizing they're not the same thing would get you into the very difficult areas of sex, economics, family, marital. That's where it turns out they're not the same. And then you go, oh, crap, there's like the solution to one is not the solution to the other, and then gets really, really hard. But to close the point, like Duginism is precisely a response to the neoliberalism, and he talks all the time about Heidegger, as we know, and the standing reserve and rejecting that. And yeah, that's a solution to the problem of confusion's masterpiece, but it's going to bifurcate the global order and make war more probable again, right? Is that what we want? Well, we have to decide. And as you know, I'll talk a lot about, look, you can become a Deleuzian individual that's going to be focused on essential difference and find your identity and meaning in that. But it might lead to an inability to think through sexual difference. It could lead to isolationism, or where you have in Japan all the people that never leave their apartment, the Hakimori or something like that. You have your essential difference, but you can't conceptually mediate relations because they're merely virtual. And but hey, yeah, that's a way to go. So this is the thing, like when we think about these sociological problems, we have to realize it's not where one of them, if we pick the right avenue, it's not like words are going to appear in the sky and say, yes, that you picked the right one, right? It's all going to be like, what do we have the highest likelihood that's going to work based on it? But this is also why we have to think all the fields, because all the fields have different lessons that you can learn from. And what works in, say, philosophy may not work in also economics. So you need something that works in philosophy and economics and in the libidinal and in the social and so on and so forth. What often happens between the local, the state, the national, and the global is what's a solution for the local for meaning and belonging does not allow it to operate with the rest of the state, because Virginia, I live in Virginia. Virginia is a wonderful example of this. Southern Virginia is insanely different from Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is like Washington, D.C., Arlington, Springfield, et cetera, so forth. Southern Virginia is Danville, Lynchburg. It's like very rural, very Republican. But up north is very Democrat and very liberal. It might be the most liberal, right? Just about as you go, right? Well, what Northern Virginia does directly impacts Southern Virginia, because they vote in the elections, they put people in the state Congress, et cetera, so forth, right? How do I, as a subject, if you grant me that phrase in this context, how do I live with that without saying, well, we're just going to like go to war with the North or segregate or do everything in our power to gerrymander the map so that the South has more power than the North, so we're not alienated, right? How do you avoid that problem? Because my solution, and now here's the issue. If I'm part of a state that comprises, say, people who are very different from me, say in Southern Virginia, it's Republican, conservative, and I find belonging in that. But Northern Virginia, I know, has very diverse, multicultural communities. How do I know that the state that I live in and that the legislator that I am part as is influenced directly by worldviews that are not my own? And how do I live with that in a manner that doesn't make me pathological, right? Well, guess what? The pure free market worldview will not provide me those resources. I've got to think outside of that worldview to think about the between space of worldviews, right? Well, that's an entirely different ballgame. And now you have to start thinking, okay, how do I relate to otherness, right? And obviously I'm alluding to Hegel. Obviously you're leading to all these different philosophers. All right, well, then you move up the chain to the national. Well, that's even bigger now, because you're dealing with an entire nation that is making policies. Say, if you have a small business, what the IRS decides to do directly impacts the kind of business that you can do. Do you believe in free markets? Do regulation? Is that just the central planner getting bigger and bigger and so on and so forth? What ends up happening is that as you go up the chain, what proves to be an explanation and arguably even an address on the small scale doesn't apply on the large scale. But if you're not able to have a certain gymnastic kind of mobility in your thinking as you move up the scale and realize, oh, what works on the local doesn't necessarily work on the state or the national. And if you can't see that, here's the problem. Most people see that as a contradiction. And the moment they see it as a contradiction, it's invalid. Well, this is why, for me, I got so interested in Hegel, right? Because in Hegel, contradiction actually is like the basis of thought. If you're not thinking contradiction, arguably, you're not even thinking, right? You have to suffer that pain, right? Well, basically, in a globalized world, everyone has to think many levels at the same time. And if they have been taught that if you're in pain when you think, most people have been led to believe that when you think, if you're in pain, you're not thinking right. Thinking is supposed to be freedom from pain, actually. Thinking is supposed to be oh, I figured it out. I'm free now, right? That's what we've been taught. Thinking will set you free or something like that. Flannery, when John, it says the truth will set you free, Flannery O'Connor's hilarious. He's like, yes, the truth will set you free and make you weird and make you miserable. Like the truth sets you free. It just turns out that freedom is death. But that's not what we tend to, from an Enlightenment paradigm, think, right? So without the right framing of the need to think these different levels in difficulty, then we're just looking for an autonomous solution. And basically what everyone does is they take the solution that genuinely works. It does work on the local level. Of course it works on the local level because it's not scaling. The problem is always scale. It works, and then they say, well, just do that on all levels. No, that's when you get the banality of evil. That's when you get totalitarianism. That's when you get pathologies and collapse and different things. So we have to think levels. We have to think interaction with difference. We have to think economics, and we have to be able to think contradiction, which turns out it's not really a contradiction. It's the necessary, like in the sense of a logical contradiction, it's the ability to hold together different approaches on different levels, because we're not living in a single level at a time. We're living in many levels at the same time. So what I would say is that breakdown precisely between the local, in like in America, the local, the state, and the federal generally, is precisely what brings out all of the problems that these sociologists are talking about that you could ignore, practically ignore up until now. But now that we're forced to face them, we don't have the conceptual tools to face them. And so you're having pathological breakdown reactions, turning to straw men, radical isolationism, and all these different things. So what you just highlighted is what brings out all these problems. These problems have always existed, but until now, you practically didn't have to worry about them. They existed, but they weren't practically encountered. Now, everyone in their very everydayness is having to respond to it, which then leads to, what do we do about it? What's the right approach?
Yeah, well said. There's something that's coming out of your response, which is generating an interesting thought in my mind as it relates to actually integral models. So in integral models, you have this, and actually, I've discussed this with Bruce Alderman, is that in integral models, you have a integration of knowledge or paradigms across human history or time. So you have, you have the importance of including for example, pre-modern and the modern, and the postmodern and the modern, and the meta-modern and the postmodern. These are all sort of temporally conceived. But it seems like what you're bringing to the conversation with the explanation in Belonging Again is there's something super important about integrating all of those temporal dimensions, but there's also something super important about integrating all of these spatial levels. Because it's one thing to think in time, because it's almost like if we can think of difference temporally, like I have to include the pre-modern, or I have to include the modern, or I have to include the postmodern. It's almost like that difference is in the past and I'm bringing it to the present. But when you think a spatial model of the local, the national, the global, and you have to think about all of those real differences simultaneously now, then there's something about that real difference which is not so easy to just integrate. There's something about that which confronts you with a fundamental otherness or an essential difference. And I want to just labor for a moment on the point you made about the Deleuzian individual and essential difference, and the way in which you could potentially prevent thinking sexual difference, is that if you don't go through the process of actually tarrying with the ground of essential difference or the ground of real difference, and you just reify it in sort of like a creative individual expression, it could be that that real difference ends up undermining you from within. Yes. Or it could be that that real difference ends up, ungrounding you in a way that's quite disturbing and problematic. And so what you're bringing here, I think, is the importance of thinking a sociology on the level of different levels of the present moment, but also the importance of thinking, what I appreciate your thought is that focus on the tragic sociology and the tragic economics, where you're not just in a problem solution situation, but a problem management situation. Now, the question I have for you here is, taking all that into consideration, these different levels of the present moment and the tragic nature of real difference, is what does the discovery of Philip Rieff have to do with this? And what have you discovered in your mediation of Philip Rieff, because as you know, at the beginning of Belonging Again, Philip Rieff seems to be a central figure and someone who's with you along the way. And how does he help you think through these things?
Well, all of that was absolutely tremendous. Bruce Alderman is amazing, as is Layman Pascal. I really respect their work on the integral stage and love learning from them. And in fact, the topic of integral, generally in all transparency, I have a negative reaction to, say, spiral dynamics when I read it. Because I tend to come from someone who really emphasizes in my thought the material condition. I don't like the idea of personality evolution or the notion that there are certain consciousnesses that can handle paradox and they have a certain sort of structure. Now, of course, all the people in spiral dynamics will say, well, no, blue has a role, green has a role, everyone has a role. And so there's a kind of integration in it. But then the question becomes, where does that integration come from? And looking at from an economic background, it comes from the material condition. It does not come from, say, reading philosophers and having an enlightenment. For some people, it does, right? But the issue is, the book goes to great lengths to say, we have to be careful to assume that what is a quote unquote address for a minority is an address for everyone. That's the problem of scale. Absolutely. Say certain spiral dynamic ways of thinking can be a way that some percent of people can find meaning and belonging and understand the current situation. The question is, does that work at scale, or does it work for people of a certain ethnicity, certain economic background in way of personality disposition, right? Because that's all, the reason why you end up in economics is because of the problem of, well, funny enough, different, right? So Deleuze is correct to be concerned about difference. The question is how he goes about it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think what you're going to get at when you start getting on this kind of this edge problems is in the same way that in theology, you look back on some of these Christian debates and councils where they're going you almost want to just roll your eyes. It's does it really matter if Jesus is bestowed or beget? I mean, come on. No, it does matter. Does it really matter if Jesus is, a hypostatic union or if he's fully man? No, it really does matter, because that completely changes the paradigm in which you operate in organized society, right? If Jesus is 100% spirit, for example, then why does the material world matter, right? If the God the Father is all that you emphasize and you forget the Trinity, well, then you kind of end up with a notion of God that doesn't have community at its very heart, and that can be consequential. So these nitpicky orderings, it's everyone agrees on the main terms, but the ordering of the terms and the mediation of the terms is different, and it seems nitpicky. But in the same way that if you go to the foundation of a building and you're off by an inch, the whole thing can be off. So it goes, say, in the different, Hegel and Deleuze end up talking about incredibly similar things, right? They seem to and sometimes be identical. And yet then there is also seemingly these small differences that if you take seriously, everything becomes problematic. So likewise with spiral dynamics, generally speaking, the notion of potential evolutions of personality, there seems to be reality to that, obviously. And also, in the same way that I have a natural reaction against spiral dynamic thinking, I also remember when I naturally despised Hegel, and now then I got egg in my face. So, I don't like meta-modernity, all of these different thinkers. I have to check myself as a subject to go, am I just assuming there's stuff there that isn't there, or maybe I need to read more? But then, of course, it becomes difficult. Eventually, you have to make a stand, right? And that's always the tension. So it goes with Deleuze. I always am okay, let me try to understand the transcendental empiricism again. It really strikes me like the science of logic, but maybe I'm just reading into it and you're always, but actually, I think that's good. Actually, as a note, that very tension that you learn in the experience of reading and rereading and not being sure, that actually, I think, trains you to deal with the very sociological conditions we're describing again that are so tragic, that you're learning to live with and deal with and to go back and revisit. So there's almost, in the same way that Viveki will talk about an ecology of practice, I actually think the practice of reading a really difficult book and rereading and forcing yourself to read people you disagree with and to go back on is precisely the kind of practice that can be kind of beneficial in different things, right? But for me, and then of course you got people like the genius Zach Stein talking about personality to development, and that guy knows what he's freaking talking about. So who am I to say that field has no truth to it or anything, right? But to me, what you do learn in economics is that what tends to be primary is the material condition, and that's obviously Marx as well, right? it is probably the case that the majority of people that are able to deal with paradox, I can't ever remember because there's like integral, there's a difference between integral and spiral. Like there's different colors here. It's like green and coral or something, whatever it is. There's one personality type that's able to deal with difference very well and integrate with it. I bet you those people have access to the internet. I bet you they're able to get online and read different texts and encounter difference. I bet you a lot of them went to college because that tends to bring what brings difference together, right? Well, that would mean there's a material condition that trains them to have that change in personality, right? So you can't really, that's the thing, you can never separate the changes of the subject from the material situation, right? And basically what we've done though is acted like you can do that. So we haven't really concerned ourselves very much with topics of the material condition, the economics, the sexual, the subject, the working through. We've acted like it's possible to basically either give everyone enough of a paycheck and make them all part of the middle class, and then all the problems of the subject will go away, or we'll just evolve personality enough to deal with difference, and then we won't have Trumpism anymore. Not so simple at all, because doing that requires material condition. And the moment you talk about material condition, you're talking about incentivizing people to create that material condition, money, incentives, all of those different things, right? And that's where you get into all the trouble of a new pricing mechanism, digital assets, work of Anthony at Intrinsic Research Co., and so on and so forth. So I really appreciate Layman and Bruce, because I think they're very aware of this tension in moving between and being aware of the entire picture all at once. And anyone who is in the integral space, and I know they'll talk a lot with meta-modernity, who's actually keeping their eye on that ball and keeping aware of it and trying to think through all of that as best as possible, is extremely noble. And it's very difficult to do that without falling into what Hegel calls one-sidedness. So I appreciate what they tried to do there. On the Philip Rieff question, Philip Rieff, to me, was a bombshell, precisely because, one, in the same way that Zizek talks about when he finds Lacan, one of the reasons he became so Lacanian is because he felt like there was descriptive power there. It wasn't like he said, oh, I want to be a Lacanian. It was simply that he read the book and was like, oh, this seems to match what I experience. It's like Javier was saying with Hegel, look up, look on, right? If you look on, you go, yeah, what Lacan's describing here, that seems to be right. That seems to exactly be what people do. In the same way that for me, coming from a literary background, so let me put it this way, like in reading, say, William Faulkner, a whole lot of William Faulkner, a whole lot of the Southern writers who are talking about rebuilding society after the collapse of idols with the Civil War. Someone once asked Walker Percy, why is it that the South in America creates so many good writers? And he said, it's because we lost the Civil War. And what he meant by that is you're forced to face the subject. You can't hide anymore. And that's what you see in William Faulkner, someone who knows that the Confederacy, and actually I would say that studies of the Civil War is extremely useful to prepare you for tragic sociology. Now that was a giant claim, but reading your Gary Gallagher's, your Selby Foots and all that will show you all of these problems historically. That was a big point I just made. That would require 5 hours, but if you grant me that. So you read all these Southern writers and you say, oh, and the Russians as well, because they likewise had their idols collapsed. And you read your Pushkins and your Chekhovs and different things. You say, this is how families are like. This is what societies are like. It's like the very givens that give you belonging and a sense of home. What gives the very prestige of the Compson family is also the very thing that enslaves Black people. Is the very thing that creates slavery. The very thing that creates belonging and home and identity is also sociologically what oppresses, right? And you read that in literature and you sense that from literature and you sense all of the pathologies that result from that trade-off. And then you encounter Philip Rieff, and for the first time in your life, you feel like someone is actually sociologically describing what's going on. And then you look up Rieff and you run into Peter Berger, then you run into John Hunter and all of these different people. The reason I got into Rieff, frankly, is actually serendipitous. A very good friend of mine, the great and legendary Vincent Zimmern, who I adore, just sent me the book. He said, I read this book. It's really, really good. I think you'd find it interesting. Yeah, I did. All right. Basically, the book would, Belonging Again would not exist without Vincent Zimmern just one day mailing me a copy of this book. And it happened, you know how sometimes in your life you encounter a book that just happens to be exactly the book you needed to read at that moment? It was basically that, because of some different, like back in 2016, where I was very Humean, but then I started to realize, oh, wait, Hume actually is just going to end you up. Hume is extremely necessary for the conversation, but Hume he doesn't have enough to help you deal with the global order, globalization, and when capitalism fails, ultimately. He can't provide you with that. Yeah, you can isolate yourself into your common life and have nothing to do with outside community and overcome the philosophical melancholy that leads to depression and sadness and all that different stuff. but that's also perhaps what happens with Deleuze. It's the same. It's actually kind of funny enough, there can be similarities between autonomous Hume and autonomous Deleuze. And then once you figure out, you encounter this book and say, oh, now there's a description here of what is occurring through history that is a collapse of Gibbon's releases. Now I have a dialectical thinking, like the dialectic in Hume, between good and false philosophy, to think of it on a larger order. Oh, now I can understand the difference between, say, they'll talk a lot about the difference between multiculturalism and actual diversity, where multiculturalism is to say, we say, oh, people are different because they have different holidays, different outfits, different, different music. And they're like, no, that's not what culture is. Culture is the very background by which the psychology of the subject locates itself. It's not merely like, we're not different from, say, the Chinese because we have different holidays and different language. Yeah, that's part of it. No. There's an entirely different metaphysical framework in which the person situates themselves. And if you ignore that, then people become very, to regain that existential stability, they turn to totalitarianism, Nazism, large government, and things like that. So there was a lot of explanatory power there that then led me into frankly, it also felt like, it was like, why had I not heard of these people? It's the same that happens with philosophy when you encounter like this whole school of philosophy that you're never taught. You're like, what the heck? Is there why did I not know about this? I had no idea that sociology entailed this kind of thinking. I was led to believe sociology was more of what you see in modern efforts, social justice, efforts to end depression, all which have a place, but there's also an entirely other, deeply fascinating and philosophical history of sociology. And also Philip Rieff, and then I'll give it back to you. Philip Rieff is a great Freud scholar, and he's extremely interested in civilization and its discontents. And Rieff is going to go, we ignored that book. We haven't taken that seriously. And if you take that seriously, Freud can be applied to the entire social level. But what's also fascinating about Philip Rieff is he had a very strange relationship with Susan Sontag. So he himself may not have thought the sexual, and Philip Rieff himself may have needed a little bit of Lacan. I don't actually think Philip Rieff is fascinating to me also, precisely because he so well explains the situation, but then seemingly cannot do what he needs to do in his own personal life to address that explanation. And the very biography of Philip Rieff is actually really, really interesting to me, precisely because he's like, yeah, if you throw out religion and you don't know how to replace it with, you're in trouble. But I also don't want to go back to traditional religion. Okay, so what are you going to do, buddy? I don't know. Oh, okay. And I feel like actually Philip Rieff is kind of where a lot of us are right now. Basically, we're like, we understand there were problems with traditional religion or traditional sociological structures, and we don't want to go back to that, but we also realize we need to do some sort of honoring of the past. Well, what does that look like? I don't know. And Philip Rieff seemingly did not have the resources by which to progress the conversation. And so to me, that's also why honoring Philip Rieff is really important, because I think he was insanely brilliant and he correctly explained the situation, but he did not address it. And look, if you could have a career to do something like Philip Rieff did, hats off to you. That's not a hit on him in any way whatsoever. It's just that we have to continue the work. I think it's really easy to go back. Oh, they didn't think this. Oh, they didn't think that. They didn't think that. Well, you write Triumph of the Therapeutic, buddy. You started it. You see what you can do, right? It's just like, if they didn't think this, I was like, oh yeah, Philip Rieff didn't do it. Are you going to do it? Are you going to take it the next step? If not, shut up, right? If you're not going to write the book, then you be quiet. And that's also a reason why I wrote Belonging, because it's like, there's a problem in Philip Rieff. It's like, oh, but am I just going to talk about it or actually try to think it, right? And so it led to that, which then Berger, Hunter, and then addressed, which then, of course, economics and so on and so forth. Vincent Zamarin, if you're watching this, Vincent, I love you, man. You're a good man. I really love you, Vincent.
Fantastic. So there's a number of threads in there we might want to spend some time thinking about. I think the first thing is, we do live in a situation where perhaps the humanities and the social sciences in general have become, of course, very positivist, activist oriented, as opposed to taking seriously intractability, taking serious, and that also emerges in the context of widespread multiculturalism. And one gets the sense that in order to actually think diversity, you do need to bring in that more tragic lens. There is also this tendency to let's say, too easily discount certain paradigmatic thinkers and just negate them quickly as opposed to working through them deeply. And so what you get when you actually do that, as you've done with Philip Rieff, is that you almost win the capacity to critique because you've actually worked through Philip Rieff. So if you critique Philip Rieff, it's coming from almost a space where you've earned that right in some sense. Like I feel like that's the case with philosophy as well, is like, you know, there are some philosophers who I might intuitively disagree with, or I might have some perception that they're off on something, but you know, I have to remind myself to hold my tongue on certain issues, or hold my taking a stand. You know, like we have to take a stand, but we also have to know the art of taking a stand, when to take a stand, and when we're going beyond our capacities. And specifically as it regards to Philip Rieff, is that one was the interesting thing that stuck out to me in your analysis of him was that he is, on the one hand, emphasizing this absolute essentiality of social constraints, which to me in my reading of the literature on constraints and complex systems and evolution have to do with taking seriously absences, negativities, that not everything is available to you, that you're not an all being, you're not a being that has a perfect knowledge and a relationship to the complete ontology, let's say. But also, as you highlighted just now in this conversation, he's not necessarily interested in defending traditional culture. And so that's a very interesting tension point. And I do think that that is where our culture is at the moment, actually, is that I do think that more and more people are disenchanted with the multicultural limitlessness. Well, at least you should be. At least if you're reflecting a little bit, that you should be in some sense disenchanted with the multicultural limitlessness. And at the same time, there is the temptation to traditional culture, but I also feel like in a large scale sense, that's not going to work anyway. So there might be a sense in which Rieff is, on the one hand, correct to emphasize that defending traditional culture is a dead end, but at the same time, it does leave us with a strange situation. And one of the things you say in the opening of the book about Rieff is that what's also lacking in Rieff is, for example, you mentioned a few things like Rieff can't think artificial intelligence,
right,
or global capitalism, or bioengineering, or you specifically say the relationship between Nietzsche and Hegel. And on that level, it's like, I don't know how much traditional culture helps us with those things either. So where does your thinking go in regards to specifically the need for social constraint? That seems to me to be a ground upon which we could get broad agreement, and at the same time confronting AI, global capitalism, bioengineering, and things like this, not from a utopianist positive perspective, but from the perspective of well, this is really where we need thinking, and thinking in the sense of contradiction, and thinking in the sense of pain.
Yeah.
Because that's something, before I pass it on to you, that's something that I've noticed deeply in my own thinking as well, is when I first confronted, for example, singularitarian thought, I had a very, oh, this is so cool. Like, this is cool. Like when I was younger, like artificial intelligence and genetic engineering and we're going into a cool future. But it's more and more obvious that actually, yes, it could be a very cool future. Not that that's wrong. It could be a very cool future. But the level of pain on the level of our identities is going to be enormous in order to get to that coolness. And maybe that's part of the coolness. So yeah, so what what's coming to your head with this challenge?
Oh, everything, because what you just pointed out so well is the stakes. For example, and I really love Raymond, and he talks a lot about the bioengineering, Fukuyama's book. Everyone talks about the end of history, but actually Francis Fukuyama is way more interesting when he starts talking about posthumanism, biotechnology, and stuff like that. And of course, what's hilarious is Fukuyama at the end of it basically is suggesting we need to get back to something like teleology, human dignity, stuff like that, which is almost Thomism and Aquinas and different things. And you're like, oh, so get back to traditional ways of thought. Yeah, that's not going to happen. And you see Philip Rieff realize, like, the solution would go back to how things were, but that's not going to happen. Oh, okay. So what? Well, we end the book, and you can just end it there, right? Isn't that lovely? Another way to think about that is if one day you have the ability to bioengineer your child to have a super high IQ, wouldn't it be immoral for you not to? And you say, no, I should just let them be themselves. Well, then they're an adult, they can't get a job because all their friends were bioengineered, and you're a bad parent now, right? Like, this is the whole point. Every time there's a new invention, there is a change in the horizon that changes the meaning of your actions. And this is why freedom is never, like when you say, oh, consenting adults can all do what they want to do. That's true. But what your neighbor does literally changes the meaning of your choice. So for example, if you live with a neighbor who's, say, polyamorous, and you say, well, if all adults should be allowed to do what they want to do, then even though you can say that doesn't affect you, the issue is it changes the meaning of your choice not to be. Now, you could be polyamorous, right? And you're not. Why aren't you? Well, I don't know why I'm not. Oh, and now you're existentially destabilized. So the choice of the consenting adult does, in fact, impact you because it changes the meaning of your choices, right? And then you could, of course, say, well, that's good because monogamy is bigoted and limiting, and it's good that the person is destabilized with the possibility of polyamory, right? Okay, well, then you have to have that debate, right? Can you hold together a society of polyamory or not, right? Or what does it mean to have some people that do that or others, right? And so it goes with bioengineering. Like you say, well, bioengineering is just an option. It's not going to affect you. You just don't have to use it, right? Just because it exists doesn't mean you have to use it. It's not so simple. And that's why, of course, the book mentions game theory, Nash equilibrium, because that's all that, right, with John Nash, and then that's what we have to think about with address, right? So the key thing that Philip Rieff understands is that, generally speaking, possibility is always collective. When there is new possibility for some, that changes the meaning of the choices of all. And that's where you get the existential destabilization. So if you say, well, I'm Christian, I know, I think it's Hunter who says it's one thing to know that there are Hindus in the world. It's an entirely another matter when the Hindu becomes your neighbor. Oh, then it's a personalized, then you're directly experiencing it, right? And then you say, well, why am I Christian? Why am I not? Oh, I don't know. I was just born Christian. And now you've opened up the void, right? The absolute knowing, the absolute skepticism of Hume, and how do you learn to live with that? So the great insight of Hume is that. Now, the other thing that the book tries to emphasize, though, is precisely the conditions that create belonging are also the things that people seek often, because you mentioned like the social justice. So for example, let's take social justice for African Americans in America, right? Or black who feel like who've been discriminated. And of course, there's redlining. We can read Mr. Coates. My favorite is Blackness Visible by Charles W. Mills. That guy's a super genius. And he passed recently, but he was quite brilliant. And so, for example, if you've been oppressed as a minority, you want to feel like you belong in America, right? So you oppose the givens that make blacks inferior to whites. But here's the great tragedy. It is actually precisely those givens that create the thoughtlessness that creates the possibility of feeling at home because you're not existentially anxious. So what ends up happening is social justice rightly and justly opposes the givens that cause oppression to gain the feeling of home and belonging and escape of alienation that is a product of those very givens. So then they're gone, and the book will talk about the circle of acceptance, where you have a circle, and it tends to be the majority find belonging in that circle, like whites in America, for example, right? So then blacks and minority rightly and justly oppose that circle to get access to the belonging, but the very act of opening the circle makes it vanish entirely, right? And then that's the problem we face today. This is really, really important. Many conservative thinkers, like I would say Rieff, or maybe Chris, Lash is another great genius, someone like Tocqueville, we could even talk about, Edmund Burke. They understood, and Roger Scruton, who passed, they all rightly understood that autonomous liberalism, compelled by justice to create equality, could create social chaos precisely by removing the conditions that make a culture possible, because the culture is that belonging. Here's the issue. They're 100% correct. But guess what? Charles W. Mills is also 100% correct, and someone like Foucault as well, where those very norms are the things that cause oppression. This is what we haven't thought. Liberals have basically taken someone like Scruton and Rieff and all that and said they're wrong. We can create a culture on the foundation of difference alone and in multiculturalism. And the conservatives said, no, you can't do that. What we haven't thought is that they're both right, because that's the terror of the contradiction. Once you think they're both right, we have a problem. Like, we have a situation now. Like, because that means you have to somehow have a society that provides belonging without givens. That's never existed, basically. That has never existed. Now it must. What we've tried to do is create givens of having a shared economic system. We've said, oh, if everyone is capitalist, and that's what Francis Fukuyama is basically saying at the friggin' end of history, is that the new capitalist liberal order is the end of history. This will create the shared culture. It will deal with the problem of thymos, which Raymond talks so well about, and it will be good to go. The issue is it doesn't deal with thymos, which is the spirit for looking for honor, status, to belonging ultimately is tied to thymos. Capitalism can't do that. And also capitalism cannot stop game theory dynamics that lead you to a technological singularity or something, right? That's not because the technological singularity is bad. The issue is that capitalism cannot provide the way to think the subject to deal with that singularity. Oh, well, then we have to think that. Well, we haven't thought that. Oh, frick. Like what now? And to me, also on that, it's very easy to look at something like the second book has to talk a lot about Dugin, because if you really take seriously Dugin and the fourth political theory, he is absolutely aware of this problem, but his answer is basically a return to traditional culture. He's going to claim it's not. He's going to say it isn't, but it basically is. But a lot of liberal people look at Dugin and say, well, he's a fascist bigot, but then that means you don't have to think it. That's what we keep doing. You were talking about these books where you earn your disrespect. Well, you earn your disagreement. No, you have to take Dugin very seriously. In the same way you have to take the notion of, like, if capitalism cannot be the new culture that provides belonging, and it doesn't have the resources to help the subject deal with these technological singularity, well, Dugin looks over and he says, all right, well, we're just going to bifurcate and leave behind the Western world, basically. And the West is like, no, don't do that. And Dugan's like, well, then what's your answer? We don't know. Okay, then. See, that's what's currently standing, right? So likewise, similarly, conservatives will look at like liberals or the social justice people and say, okay, yes, you are correct. There's been oppression, but in the name of justice, you are destroying the conditions that make culture possible. And then the liberals will say, well, those conditions are what create oppression. So how are you going to create conditions of culture that don't oppress? And the conservatives go, we don't know. So we haven't thought this. And that's what the book is trying to frame so that we can think this, because if we don't think this, we're just gonna not do anything. It's just not going to get better.
You know, what you're framing there is, not only important, but I think it leads very nicely into a section of the first part called the legitimization crisis.
Yep.
And when we talk about institutional confidence in laws, when we talk about the health of democracy, when we think about basically, like you're saying, givens, a structure of a culture, we've just lost that. And you could frame that as just a symptom of modernity. You could frame that as a deepening in postmodernity, but certainly it's reaching crisis levels on the level of digital global culture now. If there were symptoms before, now it's kind of reached this global crisis point that I think you're framing well, and at least in regards to the relationship between Russia and the West, if we want to use those terms. And at least in terms of the stakes that you're framing with the more conservative thinkers, it seems to come down to, can we really think at the same time, including the traditional viewpoint, at the same time going into the otherness, the actual real of things like courtship, marriage, child rearing, faith, interpersonal exchange. These are some of the dimensions that come up in your book. And it seems like, as it regards to multicultural intellectualism overlooks daily life. It overlooks courtship. It overlooks marriage. It overlooks child rearing. It overlooks religious faith. It overlooks interpersonal exchange. And so this creates a very devastating cultural and intellectual environment. And, you know, it seems to me it calls for us to, one, think through these things from the ground level. But in order to think through these things from the ground level, we need the type of intellectual that's willing to include themselves in their models and willing to include themselves in their models at the root of daily life. And what do you think are the chances of that? And do you see any of the signs of that in our culture? Or is that the ground level where we need to be thinking and working now?
So that's a tremendous question. So there's a few things with that. First off, one of the ways we've been able to basically avoid a lot of these tensions is by ignoring the middle years. And what I mean by that is basically what ends up happening is capitalism in a way, and even though often I'll be kind of critiquing capitalism, I want to make it very, very clear. Capitalism is the only system that has provided a quote unquote address to what's called the pricing problem of a Friedrich Hayek, the coordination problem of a von Mises. And I've listened to some liberals respond to those problems of the distribution of resources and allocation of accidental knowledge versus abstract knowledge, and they're pitiful, now that I'm being very mean. But I've never heard a strong response to those problems other than the Chinese AI system that then you got to ask if you want to live under that, right? So we have to take very seriously the fact that capitalism is able to make it so you can go buy a wrench at Lowe's. We don't really appreciate that. Like, I recently had an issue, actually last night, there was sparks coming from the electric wire that I noticed around midnight, and I was going out there and I called up the electric company. A guy literally was out there in 30 minutes to look at it. We don't appreciate how extraordinary that is, right? And he looked at it and said, oh, it's not a big deal. We'll get a tree thing and different. But just think about that. You're literally able to call a guy to come look at an electric wire at 12:30 at night who's there just like that in case it's a fire hazard. Like, this is extraordinary. And whatever new socioeconomic game B system you're going to do, it has to also simultaneously allow me to call someone up to come check an electric wire at 12:30 at night to avoid a fire hazard. You know, but that's the real. Like, that's the real. It's much different to think about, oh, new businesses that are not going. And I'm not trying to hit on game. I think, you know, I know we've talked before about game A/B and all of those dynamics. I don't want to straw man that thinking. And again, I as a subject naturally have a knee jerk against game B. So I myself have to watch myself as I talk about it, because I haven't read all of Schleiermacher or Rudd or all these different people. I've tried, but not even close to the full canon of their work. So I always have to watch myself. And the same with the spiral dynamic stuff, right? I have to watch myself. But the point is that whatever new system you make, you have to be able to make it so I can go to Lowe's and get a wrench to fix my garage door. If it cannot do that, it's not going to work. Likewise, if my internet goes down, I need guys who know how to fix the frickin' tower. It's one like that. A concern I do have about all the digital nomad talk is who is going to create the infrastructure for the internet. And if, like, who's going to do that? The only way we figured out how to do it is a system of incentives that use competitive dynamics to its advantages and money and different things like that. You know, that's a massive problem that is not, I think, appreciated. So we have to think that. But the moment you think that, a lot of models that you think are going to work may not work. And what you're getting at is the testing. Like, what is the testing for these academic models or the university system or these ideas that would force people to realize, oh, maybe the application of this model is not as widespread as I thought. Maybe it's more of a special case. Maybe it'll address this one area in one field, but it won't solve all of society's ills or different things, right? For me, that is why I really, really like in book 2, it's going to talk about breaking up the college monopoly on credentials, because I think colleges basically and practically have a monopoly on credentials, which forces them not to be tested. because if you have to go to college to get a high-paying job, then it doesn't really matter what they're doing. You just have to go, and so on and so forth. But if colleges literally, if you could say get a job because of employment testing or didn't need academic credentials, then colleges would have to, truly create value in order for people to actually go there, right? What's happening now is people are making models by which to say address Duganism or address psychological health or different things like that are occurring in institutions that themselves do not have to be tested by people outside the institutions to see if they actually work. Because if they don't work, you still have your job and you still have to go to the college to get the credentials, right? There easily may be a lot of academics creating models that have some sort of way that can help people in certain areas. But without a test, it becomes difficult to determine that, right? So we need to create more intellectual testing. In the same way, why does the economy work so well? Because it's, Dietrich McCloskey stresses this, because it's a market test. Everyone starts a business that they think is good. If you start a business, you think it's good. The horror is you need the market test that comes in and says, oh, you thought it was good, but actually it turns out Lynchburg doesn't need another ice cream store. Sorry, buddy, but I lost all my money and I'm poor now. Yep, well, sorry. Like, that's the thing that's very interesting, is economics is ruthless. You take out a loan, you put all your dreams and hopes into something, and you go bankrupt. Like, it's cruel, it's horrible. But that's unfortunately actually what you need, is precisely to have the stuff rise to the top, right? Because you have this problem. What can happen, though, in intellectualism is not that dynamic, because there's no testing. So someone can pour all their time and hopes and dreams into a theory that they think is really useful and it's going to, help people deal with different problems. But because there's not a test, it never gets destroyed if it's bad, or elevated if it's good, right? And so we must think, basically one of the main things we have to think today is make sure there is testing everywhere. There has to be testing everywhere and constantly. One of the reasons, say, politics today is so problematic, because the only test is something that happens every 4 years, right? And it's like a one vote and it's done. But in the market, it's perpetual testing constantly. 1 week you go to Sam's and you buy these potato chips and you're like, those suck. And next week you don't buy them. Same person, different votes constantly. So that needs to happen in academia, or it tends to fall into one-sidedness. So one of the overarching points I'm getting at is basically endless testing. And I know at the STOA, Benita Roy, when they were talking with all the different people about wisdom cults, wisdom communities and different things, Miss Roy, she was emphasizing testing, the need for testing. That's exactly right. But if you take that seriously, you kind of take a razor and you go through society and see, is there testing here? Is there not testing here? Is this going to work? Is it not going to work? And you need to employ that everywhere. And conservative ideas need to be tested. Liberal ideas need to be tested. Everyone needs to undergo that testing, but you have a lack of that testing going on. And I actually think right now it is most consequential on the university level, because this is why. If indeed a lot of the problem we are describing is the work of the subject, that is a big problem. Well, so much of that is conceptual mediation, right? So if you don't have testing to determine what ideas are good or what are bad, then it's hard for people to figure out what ideas they should employ and what they should use, right? And so they get lost. Well, then Duganism wins, because you're not able to offer an alternative to that, right? Or just going toward the technical singularity wins, right? Because you don't have any alternative posturing of the subject to show an alternative way of doing things, right? So that's really consequential. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll give it back to you, if you forced intellectuals to undergo that kind of testing that I'm describing, which I do think breaking up the college monopoly on credentials would go a long way to do that, they'd have to think sex. They'd have to think economics immediately, because basically if your theory doesn't think sex and economics, the average person will not care. They will not care, because the majority of people's lives are products or greatly structured by their 9-to-5 job and their sexual relations with their partner. So if those are I don't know, man, those are 80% of people's lives. The other 20% is something else, but 80% of people's lives are in the image and likeness of sex and economics. And academic theories must think that. And I'm not saying I always think that well. I try to do better, but we must think that. And if we don't think that, then there's a problem. Now, look, if spiral dynamics can help you go, oh, I can think of my position as work because everyone has different personalities, and the fact that this guy's blue and I'm coral oh, well, we don't have to fight all the time because I'm not going to expect everyone to be like me. That's useful. That has a role, but the spiral dynamics is not going to make you the paycheck, right? Like everything has to see itself in its role and not try to overfit. It's just very, very different. Let me put it this way. It's very difficult for intellectuals not to overfit if they're not tested. If you are not tested, it is very difficult not to subconsciously believe that your ideas can address everything in all areas. And that basically is what conservatives have done with capitalism. Oh, if we have the capitalist system that will organize, that will be culture. That's Francis Fukuyama. That's a mistake. But likewise in liberalism, in more Western liberals say, oh, if we have justice, then we'll have society. Well, justice often, efforts of justice are the removal of the social conditions that make belonging possible. So that's not going to work either. But you see,
you've made that. No, you've made that case really well, and I appreciate that. And there's a number of things there that you're emphasizing, which I think are absolutely central. I mean, the first is that, well, one of the first ideas I have is that one of the greatest symptoms of the truth of what you're saying about intellectuals not being able to think sex and economics and overfitting their models in regards to really thinking through those at the ground would be an example of like Andrew Tate's university. Like Andrew Tate came up with a university, and it'll give you some sort of very distorted economic and sexual code for how to live your life. But at the same time, and there are a lot of young men, university age young men, who find it attractive because they think, well, I want to have many partners, or I want to be able to date a model, or I want to be able to have $1 million business or something like that. And I'm not going to learn that at the university. And so there's another way in which, on the one hand, you can have Duginism versus the West. On the other hand, you can have the West eating itself.
Yes.
Internal to itself. And I do think that, intellectuals taking seriously at the ground sexuality and economics is fundamental, and that actually represents also the truth of my experience at the doctoral level. Is as soon as I tried to bring up the libidinal dynamics, as soon as I tried to bring up the political economic dynamics that are intrinsic to the very structures we're doing research in, and that has an impact on the research, this was sort of a prohibition, a no-go zone. And so, yeah, thinking through the work of the subject and conceptual mediation at that level, to me would be, and also having your thoughts, tested in market dynamics is, on the one hand, extremely necessary. On the other hand, of course, I don't think everyone can do that because of the existential abyss that you have to confront in doing that. And that's the problem, is what type of intellectuals are capable of doing that. By definition, I think our moment calls such individuals forth. And so perhaps, this is all, wrapped up in what we're doing and what we're trying to birth and so forth. But it brings me to a part of the first part still, where you're talking about the dialectics of philosophical consciousness. And, you start to get into discussing some of the similarities and differences between absolute knowing, the Deleuzian individual, and specifically sort of the meaning of being a Deleuzian, or the meaning of being a Hegelian, and philosophy being its own greatest problem. And I just wonder what this specific part of your work explains, or can start to approach thinking sexuality and economics from its ground, the type of cognition we need to engage that seriously. And again, sort of to bring it around to the previous question of thinking from the ground, things like daily life, courtship, marriage, child rearing, and so forth.
Excellent. No, and you so what ends up happening, I mean, exactly what you're saying, because the stakes here, another way to think about this is, okay, we've just described why there's a very difficult sociological, societal situation going on, right? All right, so the question becomes, how do you address it? Well, you certainly can address it by just being an isolationist, right? You can do the Amish route, where you say, well, we're going to separate from technological society. And now it should be noted, Amish are not against all technology. There's like votes the community will have on what technology they use and so on and so forth. But it's more isolationist than not. You have books like in Christianity with Rob Dreyer, I believe, with the Benedict option, which is not, he says it's not isolationism, but it seems kind of isolationist, right? Well, you can have another route where you say, well, we just become kind of nomadic, which I think Deleuzianism tends to be nomadic, where you say we go into a place, maybe we have a sexual relationship, we try something for a while, and when it stops to work, we move on to the next, and we move on to the next, and we move on to the next. Well, that kind of nomadic structure can work, but can you have internet? You know, internet requires someone who has the skill to fix the internet to always be within 30 minutes so I can call them, right? You know, here's the problem you have, right? Like, you don't just need one person that knows how to fix the internet structure. You need thousands, if not tens of thousands, all over the country, all over the world, of whom can access particular geographic locations at certain times and are incentivized for me, who doesn't know how to fix the internet, to come help me. I have to be able to pay. Why should they help me? They don't know me, right? Well, money, right? Well, now we've introduced Game A, right? And so, like, Deleuze can work, but can Deleuze, you could also look at this like a question of roots. Can Deleuze give you roots? Well, no, he's rhizomatic. I mean, the whole kind of concept is not to have roots, right? And that works. And also that's going to help you avoid capture. You know, we always got to remember Deleuze is so concerned, and rightfully so. You know, France has been taken over by the Nazis. You have fascism, totalitarianism. The 20th century is recovering from the trauma of how people can be absorbed in, as you know, the book makes the distinction between mass and mob. I actually think it's a big mistake to refer to only have the language of mass and mob, because there is a sociological difference between the French Revolution and Nazism. You know, Nazism is a result of the banality of evil. You can link it together with the German nihilism of Leo Strauss, but it's very different in character from the French Revolution, which, you know, I know all Americans like to talk about, the American Revolution versus the French Revolution, but they're very different. And so Deleuze is responding to when a mass of people just fall into a strongman and are captured. And he's also aware that the more roots you have, the more perceptible you are, and therefore the easier it is to capture you, and you have the societies of control and so on and so forth. Well, you can avoid that by not having roots or not being perceptible, imperceptible lines of flight, as we know Deleuze talks about. And he, you know, Justin Murphy said, and he's right, in Deleuze, being imperceptible is not the same as being obscure. But of course, the question is, how do you determine that difference, right? So, and also, if you don't have roots, you probably don't have the internet. You probably don't have running water. You probably don't have pizza parlors that you can go to on a Friday night on a date, right? Because there has to be someone who lives in that area creating the pizza parlor. And that means there has to be roads. That means there has to be cars. That means there has to be mechanics. That means there has to be incentive for them, so on and so forth. The more we start saying, well, we need roots or people to stay in a given location for an extended period of time, well, now you need conceptual mediation. And this is where I think it's like chapter 43, where it says, you know, I intend to err more on the Nietzschean child and the absolute knower, because those are where there's such an emphasis on the commitment, on the grounded, on the not looking away and facing the immediate, right? Like if you're going to literally say, I'm going to have children, for example, well, if you're going to have children, that's about as rooted as you get. And you have to be very committed to the children. You have to pay for the bills and different things. And that means you're also going to have to learn to live with the immediacy of sexual difference regularly and constantly, and you cannot nomadically leave it behind. Well, I mean, you could, right? But that's the failure at that point. But if you might say, no, that's not a failure. We had a fling, and, you know, it was cool, and we had an experience, and so on and so forth. Well, that might just be ideology preservation, right? That might just be where you've created a worldview where it's okay to turn your back on your commitment and take the law off your neck, like Nietzsche says, and to move on. Are you sure that's not just ideology at service there? Like, you know, you say, well, no, because we're leaving behind the capitalist family and we're not in service of it. Oh, really? Maybe you just have an anti-capitalist ideology that's just serving you in your own desires and wants without forcing you to raise to the occasion and difficulty. Have to watch that one. Humans are experts at self-deception and different things like that. For me, therefore, the stakes between, as you move from, say, the Deleuze individual, which I want to stress is a kind of way to deal with the tragic sociology. As you move from Deleuze, though, toward Nietzsche and Hegel, you're adding roots, you're adding consistency, you're adding regularity. But as you move in that direction, then you have to take economics and sexuality seriously, because you have to make the pizza parlor. You have to be in the place where you can get access to the internet, not just go somewhere that has internet, right? Well, then you need someone who can create the towers, right? As you move from Deleuze toward Hegel and Nietzsche, because then, as you know, I'm going to start talking about the counter-enlightenment and human all that. Well, now economics and all that is a big deal. And once you take that as a big deal, now we have to take all of psychoanalysis, Lacan, Hegel, and different seriously. So those are the stakes, and that's why we have to move in that direction. And then the last thing with that is over there, though, where quote unquote game A deals with these problems, that's where you get institutions. But the problem is those institutions have undergone a legitimization crisis, as Habermas talks about, and for good reason, because they often preserved injustice. So now we're in a place where institutions are not legitimate. And for us, it's a giant crisis, and conservatives are like, we need to get back to institutions. No, we need to figure out the negation sublation. We need to have this be an opportunity for something new. And that's the challenge. What are the new institutions, per se, that rise out of this crisis that are not just a regression? That's what we have to think. And if we're not thinking that, then we're Deleuzian almost by default. Like that's by default what you're going to be, because that's the only legitimate, or Dugan, but I would like to think that there are other options on the table.
So I want to offer myself as a case example, a contradictory case example of the moment, because, as you know, since I've sort of become, in some sense, disaffected by the contemporary universities, I've at the same time gravitated towards studying Hegel. But in terms of my actual being in the world, I've actually lived a life which is far more like a Deleuzian nomad. And so I understand both sides of the coin in some sense. And you could even make the case that in the same, now just playing speculatively in my head, just if you go in the same way that you can go from Deleuze back to Hegel and you gain more roots, I think that's a nice way to say it. I think the people who go all the way Deleuzian, maybe schizo, they would say something like, and I've seen this a lot in theorygram spaces, they would tend to the direction of all those practical things in civilization, that's going to be taken care of by automation.
Yeah.
So they would say the tendency of civilization is towards the Deleuzian individual, and will, and on the, then to go to another position, well, you could say, well, you're saying that as a way to not think it really, because you're just throwing in automation as a solution to all these things, like, oh, we could just get robots to fix all the things, we can just get algorithms to fix all that, and then we can just be Deleuzian individuals who are just creative with no families. And so but hopefully that gives, like, not a clear position, but just sort of a picture of all of the interesting contradictions at work here, and what we need to think through. But I want to bring it now to part 2 of the book, which is lovely subtitle of Confusion's Masterpiece, which I love that. I've been thinking about that. And you actually open the second part with a point which I remember was so powerful to me when I first became an academic, which was Durkheim's observation in sociology that with the rise of modernity, you also have the rise of suicide. I thought that was just absolutely fascinating when I first learned sociology. And it has something to do crucially with modern freedom being too much to bear. And it's almost like the rise of the Deleuzian individual, or even the Nietzschean overman, being something that is, some people might revel in it, some people might fully go into it and enjoy it, and other people might look at it as the greatest terror possible, and we cannot go in that direction, and they might recoil to extreme traditionalism or extreme authoritarianism or an extreme backwards reaction in some sense. Now, what I want to get to here is the phenomenon, which is that in our situation, you say, we have individuals, as I say, individuals have friends. Even that is increasingly questionable, even though we have online friendships and stuff like that. But no real community. And what I see is, I like the word network, because the reason why network, because each individual have so many overlapping communities that it's impossible to know that what you define as the community is something that's inherently particular and exclusive. And that's true. But with the rise of the network, it's like so many people are associated with so many different communities that it's hard to know the in and out of a community. It's hard to know the boundaries. The boundaries, in some sense, it looks like a rhizome.
Yeah.
And so these are the thoughts going through my head, and seems like a lot here could potentially be thought through in regards to the let's call it the Rieff problem. The Rieff problem of constraints, but not knowing how to think these constraints in the current situation.
That was marvelous. I like the Rieff problem a lot. And I think you are correct that for a lot of Deleuzians, automation will take care of the problem. It might. But I also, I in Christianity, for example, when you had Christians that say they saw the world or the church was becoming problematic, they said, well, the second coming is going to occur and it's going to be okay. And also at the end of the day, God's grace saves everyone, so you can't mess up. If in your ideology, you can't fail or the future is just going to take care of it for you, that probably is a function of ideology, and you have to be careful of that. And religion has been notably, with like doctrines of the second coming or rapture or things like that, have been very susceptible to that. But it's in Marx, you say, well, you'll have the universal class because the governing power will dissolve the power back to the people. Unfortunately, that's not what tends to occur. If you give the central planner the power, they tend to keep the power, right? Theoretically, could you have that centralization and then give it back and have the communist state? Absolutely. But unfortunately, that's not always what occurs. So how do we think the fact that that's not what always occurs? Theoretically, if free markets stayed small and you had small business that didn't turn into corporatism, you could have a very functioning system like described like Hayek. Unfortunately, it's the nature of the very rationality of market to get in bed with government, to become corporation and not be susceptible to market forces. And you have to think that, right? And so it is like, I think that's what we have to think of. There is a ton of descriptive power in Deleuze, right? The issue is that little point, right? That you say, well, automation will take care of it. Is that true? Is that true? Sounds like a second coming. I would be careful with that because we have no concept of what automation will do. Like, what is, like, so for example, what is money if nobody works? Why is money valuable? Money has value because it's hard to get. If money is not hard to get, then what's the value of it? Okay, well, so the AI is taking care of all of those menial tasks, which I question, because menial tasks like planting a garden is way harder than you think. And arguably is requiring more complexity than solving a math problem or something like that from a computation standpoint. That's all fine though. But why should the automation serve you, Deleuze individual? Why is it going to help you get internet? Why not just certain people who own the AI, right? I'm not saying necessary, but there's a million questions that open up that you have to be. That's one of the best things I did learn from the Austrian economists like Hayek or von Mises is they an economy consists of a million things you couldn't ever possibly dream to think up. And so if you're going to replace the pricing mechanism, it's hubris. Like, you've lost your mind. Like, the great example I always make is you can be Albert Einstein, but unless you work at the McDonald's down the street, you have no idea how many plastic straws they need to order for next week. that only can be known in the particular situation of working at the McDonald's. It has nothing to do with intelligence, right? Well, it's also hubris to think the future. Like once you start saying, oh, in the future, AI will take care of it. Oh, in the future, Jesus will come and fix it all, right? There's a hubris in that because you don't have to think the unthinkable. And that's basically what we're getting at. Like, what does it mean if you cut off from yourself the ability to assume that in the future there will be some sort of solution, that's going to make it so we can all be Deleuzian individuals and not worry about it. If you cut that possibility off from you, well, now you have to think. If you negate it, now you have to think. And I think you have to think. I guess I've seen, basically from my experience, I've seen what happens in religion. If you don't think, it's bad. You get taken up by totalitarianism, the ideology becomes cancerous, it becomes probably, destructive and things like that. So we have to think that, otherwise we're going to be in tremendous trouble. And then if you think that, then you start going, okay, we know that there is this break between givens and releases, right? We know there's this problem. But it's the pricing mechanism only really works really regarding products that are in the real world, like wrenches. But how do you sell like online courses? How do you sell intellectual work and financially support philosophers outside an academic studio or an academic scenario, right? We have to think those because that's a problem now. That's a problem right now. You can't say, oh, in the future it will be taken care of. Someone will create a game B and it will be taken. Well, maybe. But that's, you don't have to think it. So you have to think the now. And so what Philip Rieff, let me just say quickly on that point as it regards to game B, it's like, it's a weird thing to me because it's like in game B, we'll have a space for philosophers, and we'll have a space for artists, and we'll have a space for these creatives. And I'm just like, I'm sitting there as like, I'm literally the philosopher that hypothetically you would want in game B, but there's nothing there. Sure.
Like it's not there. It's not actual. I just want.
No, and look, like a lot of the game B thinking, in my opinion, is a response to certain realities of what Schleiermacher talks about, the meta crisis, AI, global warming, and these are all.
Do you mean Schmachtenberger?
Do I say Schleiermacher? Wow, I'm thinking the theologian. That's so the Schleiermacher. I just can't say words. I can't say words, so I struggle with it. But yes, Daniel, like all the stuff he's talking about on Rebel Wisdom and all that, that's all legitimate. The question is, well. I think he said this to Weinstein once when I was listening to him. Maybe it was Dark Horse, I can't remember, on the question of like sexual rivalry, where basically the solution was, well, we just have to overcome sexual rivalry, right? We need to, we have to learn to overcome those game theory dynamics. That's probably not going to happen. And you see that the problem is with that, like that's just like the automation with the Deleuzian. We're saying like it's a kind of second, like, well, theoretically, if we overcame sexual rivalry, game B would work. Well, yes, it would. But is that going to occur, right? Or do you tarry with it? The big move in Hegel is you're tarrying with the negative. You are assuming that sexual rivalry will always be there, right? Like it's going to be there, and we have to think it and operate assuming it is there because it's now, right? Well, that's an entirely different ball game than creating a model around the overcoming of sexual rivalry. And the reason why I bring up sexual rivalry, because basically the entire socioeconomic order emerges out of sexual rivalry if you take it seriously. Why do you get capitalism? Precisely because people, we have not seen societies where you can have children with lots of different people and those children not lead to mass orphanages or orphans everywhere in the streets, which are problematic. What we have seen is generally people want to have a certain sense of regularity with their sexual partner that they can rely on to help them deal with children. And then they want to be able to take care of that family, which means they need a job. And if they need a job, they need a capitalist order to get that job. And now we're in game A. Like that one little point that in the entire arguably brilliantly thought out structure of game B, but that one little point, almost like the Kurt Gödel's incompleteness, boom, the whole thing blows apart. Likewise, I say, and it's cruel. It's so cruel in a way, but the market is cruel. You put all your hopes and dreams into your restaurant and nobody eats at it. It's so cruel. And yet that's how it goes. I've seen in religion, one little mistake in your theology And you might have, the Catholic Church, like the whole idea that priests should not be married. Well, guess what? That one, I think that's a theological mistake. It causes the greatest scandal in Catholic history, right? I think there's a giant mistake in some Pentecostal thinking in American Protestantism, made him extremely vulnerable to Trumpism. One little theological mistake, but that's all it takes. That's all it takes. And that's what I don't think, honestly, that might be the real that the intellectual does everything in their power to avoid. Like, that is terrifying if you take it seriously. One little mistake and the whole thing's useless. This is terrifying. But that's what we have to think. But the likelihood of us thinking it without being tested is very low. That's why you need these market tests, or you need the breakup of the college monopoly on credentials to think those things. Because for me, what you mentioned are Durkheim, and then I'll give it back to you. If you take that seriously, if you take it seriously that suicide increases, as does middle class education, all of these different things, everything changes suddenly. You cannot solve the world's problems with the middle class, and suddenly the human is a mystery to themselves. Like, the human is a kind of alien, right? Walker Percy will talk about it in his wonderful Lost in the Cosmos book, and he talks about Durkheim as well. And you take that seriously, it also means that money is not enough. Like, that's where the Washington consensus collapses. Culture matters, because culture is basically the background of the subject, or culture is what the subject situates themselves in. And this is what Berger and Hunter and all of them scream. If we think about culture as simply holidays, food, outfits, all these kind of like people in China, they listen to this music and they have these holidays, then you don't realize that culture is the very operating background of the subject. And that means if Durkheim's right, you have to take culture seriously. Well, guess what culture comes from? Roots. Oh, crap. We can't have the Deleuzian individual then. And again, I want to stress, obviously, the Deleuzian individual can describe a certain percent of the population. That's the other mistake we've made. Like, of course, it addresses some percent of people. The issue is it the overall address for the Rieff problem? Well, no, because it cannot be, because of the economic problems that we are describing, and the fact that you have to have people provide the restaurant and the streets and all those different stuff. And you can only avoid that problem with the second coming of automation. Basically, that automation will take care of all of that. Okay, well, great, we're done.
Yeah.
We might be done.
Well, I've actually often thought that a lot of the technological singularity thinking has, in its most naive forms, a type of Christian eschatology built into it unconsciously, not often reflectively inscribed into the theories. And actually, I've seen a lot of cases where if you bring up the connection between Christian eschatology and technological singularity, a lot of the technological rationalists will disavow that connection, and it seems very obvious in some sense that it's there. But in any case, I think that there is this importance of roots, and that if you include, like, in this oscillation between, on the one hand, the intellectual substructure of modernity being a type of culmination in, I think, German idealism, and also leading directly to Marxism, and then you connect it more to the roots of postmodernism with Nietzsche, and then going all the way to Deleuze, that you would have a better way of thinking, actually, the mediation and the conceptual mediation of subjectivity. Because, of course, the Deleuzian individual speaks to an important truth, which might have to do with creativity and art and autonomy and exploration, and the positive benefits of the positive side of nomadism is, you're always exposing yourself to a new environment and differences, and a larger picture of the world, perhaps. But then if you totally leave out roots, and if you totally leave out the developmental process, and you totally leave out political economy, and you totally leave out culture as the background for the individual, and if you totally leave out the fact that Nietzsche isn't just talking about the child, but he's also talking about the camel and the lion.
That's right.
Then you're left with a pretty hollow, vapid, empty creativity, or a creativity with no one around to even appreciate it in a culture. So, this whole picture is really important. But then at the same time, if we get that, if we can somehow think that whole picture, and if we can somehow embody that whole picture, more importantly, embody that, because I understand, like, for example, the Deleuzean nomadic end and the importance of that. And I also understand the importance of rooting and thinking from the ground of sex and economy and culture and things like that. And if that can be modeled, then you would have the potential to address, I think, the legitimization crisis and the authorization crisis, which is so symptomatic of our time. Now, in your text, in the very core of, I think, the belonging again, the second major essay, belonging again, you get into the growth of the state and international capital, and the way in which these are at a tension with each other. It's like, how do you feel this is playing out in America? And do you think the way it's playing out in America has ripple effects for the world as a whole? And do you see a third between these two?
Excellent. And I want to make it very clear that if you do not take seriously the lessons of Deleuze, then you end up with roots, but you're in the banality of evil. Like, Deleuze is a necessary step in the philosophical journey, as I've taught, to avoid Nazism, basically. And you don't want to be captured. You want to learn how to be imperceptible without being obscure. There are things to learn in Deleuze, but it's like, as I always talk about with Hume, you start in common life, and that's where the banality of evil can go on. You go to the ivory tower to learn philosophy, as you must, but it's tempting to stay there, and then you end up in the autonomous rationality. Likewise, you go to Deleuze, you learn Deleuze. The trick is the return to common life, the bringing of Deleuze into rootedness, right? This is what we have to think. This is the insane contradiction that's so painful that must be thought. There's a wonderful legendary saint of Simone Weil who talks about, like, attention. She talks about the necessity of rootedness. And in my opinion, the resources of thinking this, as you know, and then I'll get to the extremely important question on international capital. This is all, in my opinion, what the counter-enlightenment and the modern encounter-enlightenment has thought and have been exploring, and their resources were simply overlooked because they didn't readily fit into the academic discourse. They were not easy to fit. And likewise, Zizek does not fit easy into the academic discourse, and therefore he can be overlooked in the academic realm, right? But we have to think something that doesn't fit in the modern discourse, because the modern discourse is the problem, of course. So that is what's kind of going on. And so for example, I was talking about spiral dynamics, which again, I have a respect for, but then there's also an incompleteness there, but so it goes with a lot of Christianity, right? So what's the difference between the evolution of personality and the evolution of consciousness in a Rudolf Steiner or like an Owen Barfield, right? They can overlap, but are they the same? I think a lot of spiral dynamic persons would love the idea of the evolution of consciousness to have experiences of new qualia, and they would want to include that. But is that included in the theory? If not, do we make a big deal of it? Do we let them go together and continue about our way? What should the nature of academic discourse be? We don't want to be like these colleges that go, no, that's not what you meant, therefore you're the enemy. We don't want to do that. Well, let me put it this way. What's really funny to me, and then I'll answer the question, is there so much emphasis in the Game B on not having like rivalrous dynamics? Those rivalrous dynamics are absolutely still at play on the online intellectual communities. So we're not embodying what we say we want to do. This is what we're doing. We're critiquing capitalism while doing the things that we critique capitalism for. So we've got to be different. If we're going to have a different liminal web, or whatever term people use, intellectual community, then it must not be like that. We have to learn the art of, well, what Hunter talks about with substantive democracy, the ability to disagree substantively while simultaneously negating sublating, not simply drawing lines and like fighting to death over pro-life, pro-choice, or whatever, right? But this is way harder than here's the problem. This is way harder than it seems, because the involvement of the subject and identity and sexual rivalrous dynamics, like we as human beings kind of suck. And so doing this is really hard. And basically, like, you have to take Lacan and the like seriously, because if you don't think it's hard, it's probably because you're doing it wrong. you're probably part of the problem. If you think it's easy to do this kind of stuff, then you might be one of the characters in Chekhov, like an Uncle Varva or something like that. That's actually part of the problem. So it's very important, I think, to realize the stakes here and the need for online communities, not simply to be universities online, but an entirely different sort of intellectual exchange. To the question of international capital, what happens in America does affect the entire world, because America, one, the dollar is the reserve currency. Two, it is still the police force of the globe, even if it shouldn't be. And three, America, just by virtue of being so economically strong, what America does, everyone has to do. Like, we single-handedly can cut off Russia's access to the global financial system. Should we be able to do that? Should the dollar be the reserve currency? Those are entirely different questions, but it has a massive influence. And what happens in America tends to be what other nations think they should do if they want to be a land of the free. Now, of course, that's changing because America became complacent in that and therefore created space for Duginism to respond in the BRIC nations and all of that. And if you want to say, well, the BRIC nations have never been as economically strong as it seems, and it is true, if I'm not mistaken, the BRICS were actually created by Goldman Sachs as a new ETF. It was never like an official thing. Goldman Sachs came up with it to invest in an ETF or something. And then they went, hey, that's a good idea. We should do that kind of political structure. So it's kind of in a way fake thing, although unfortunately, with time, it's become more real because America has kind of failed in some regards in its leadership role. And it's failed in its leadership role because it has not been dialectical. It has not thought in terms of how can you deal with the tension of givens and releases. Basically, for me, because since America does have an influence, and I'm not trying to say what happens in America necessarily happens everywhere, but since America has not thought this dialectical tension, because it hasn't thought dialectically, it's just thought, frickin' tribally, I guess, us versus them, the rest of the world has been like, well, those guys have no idea what they're doing. So they've either fallen themselves into popularism. You have emergences of popularism in Europe. And I even don't want to make it sound like all forms of popularism are bad. We have to be careful with that. But if you grant me the term, we've seen that emerge in Europe. You've seen it emerge in Brazil, a lot of Central America. And then other nations who were kind of fallen, China is the great example. I think America's failures are really shown in China, because China was indeed becoming increasingly capitalistic. You had more people brought out of poverty than ever before in China, and you had an engagement doctrine under the Obama administration with China. Well, starting with the Xi Jinping corruption campaign around 2014, when all the pro-Western people gradually and silently were removed from government, America was incapable of showing an alternative to the way that China was going was wrong, right? And why should China not go in a more authoritarian direction if America is not able to handle the tension between givens and releases? If we're not able to show some sort of alternative, why not go in that direction? Well, because it oppresses people. We're freaking voting for Donald Trump. We are voting for, increasingly you see Western nations arguably acting authoritarian. Now, I even have to step back and be careful with a caricature of Donald Trump, because even someone like Donald Trump is more complex than what is made out to be, right? But the point is that America's failure to deal with the problem of international capital and to avoid corporatism monopolies has resulted in it not seeming so problematic to have a government model that is more monopolistic, right? And so then the nation has fallen right into the hand of bifurcation, Duginism, and things like that. So, and then we ourselves are inventing things like AI, ChatGPT, and whatever, and we're all like, we should shut it down because it's going to destroy us all. Literally, we have people on Lex Friedman saying this sort of stuff. Well, then it seems like these other nations, to separate from America, were pretty smart, because we might be unleashing some sort of technological apocalypse, right? And so America's failure to think this has resulted in not it losing its global currency, so it still economically has massive influence. It's lost all cultural influence. It's lost the ability to show a cultural alternative, and that's why we have to think this now. Otherwise, don't get so upset with Duginism. Don't get so upset with China. Don't get so upset with these more totalitarian structures, right? If you're not going to think this and offer alternatives, well then, okay, accept it. there's arguably that's perfectly fine. People have to live their lives, take care of their kids, so on and so forth. But if we're going to be intellectuals, if we're going to do intellectual work and we're going to claim that and we're going to make that our concern, then you must think this. And if you're not thinking this, it's like you're not doing basically for me, you're not doing your job. I mean, if you don't like the job, then do something else. But, this is the job. This is the work. And if this is not thought, then I don't know what we're doing, right? It's just a hobby. And there's something fine about hobbies, but I think there are real stakes.
Absolutely, there are real stakes. And I just want to sort of zero in on this emphasis that you put on USA as a leadership role due to economics, but that it has not thought through, let's say, the dialectics of society.
Yes.
And as a consequence, that it's lost some cultural influence as in terms of being a beacon and a leader for social freedom and perhaps the way to go culturally. And I just want to sort of reflect on the fact that America right now is in a culture war, which I think you also bring up in the book, is related to the politics of the body. Yeah. And that involves sexuality, that involves race, that involves gender orientation, LGBT plus and stuff like that. And we've also mentioned in this, or you've mentioned in this conversation, that those same forces of activism which seek to be included are the same forces that can undo belonging. And so what perhaps we need to think is perhaps the reconsolidation of courtship and long-term partnership and roots, which simply accommodates for a larger and a more accurate concept of identity than the original sources of belonging were able to accommodate. I mean, right. I think like perhaps the greatest example of that is the history of whites and blacks in America, where you do have intense lines being drawn and segregations being drawn, and also in between Christianity and sexual orientation. You have intense lines being drawn, and that comes up in your book as well. Both of those topics come up in your book as key culture war talking points. And it's just, in order to do that, I do think we need to fully pass through the contradictions of our identities. And without passing through the contradictions of our identities, it doesn't seem like belonging on that level is thinkable. But at the same time, if we do pass through the contradictions of those identities, then it seems to me like America would have the opportunity to once again become the dominant cultural influence, not just in terms of exporting its pop culture, but in terms of pointing the way forward in terms of its ethical social mediation.
Right. Because
if America can deal with that level of difference, then it literally is a representation of what other nations and other peoples can follow, because arguably speaking, America accommodates more sexual, racial, and gender differences than any other place on the planet. It certainly does more than Japan. It certainly does more than most countries in East Asia. And if you take, for example, situations in like some developing nations in Africa, they'll actually put people to death for being gay.
Yeah.
Like there are situations in Kenya where people are being sentenced to death just simply for their sexual orientation. So it seems to me like that's the cultural stakes of the identity politics war, and what I'm increasingly trying to develop a language for, which would be a movement from identity politics to contradictory politics. So what maybe some thoughts there that come up in terms of the stakes there?
That was all really, really good. And I really love that idea of contradiction politics. That's extremely good. And it does make me think of what Hunter talks about with substantive democracy. So there's a few things. One, to say that America has had kind of a dominant cultural influence is not to necessarily say that it should have a dominant cultural influence, or that that's a good thing, or so on and so forth. Those are different questions. The issue is that the moment, if you want to say that America, like where America goes, the world doesn't go, that would just kind of almost be empirically false. because simply the economic dominance that it has. You could also make an argument that, you know, America almost screwed Britain at Bretton Woods with making Britain take on the war debts and that's why it became the global reserve currency. I mean, you could make an argument that that was all actually quite underhanded. And arguably, one of the strong claims of, say, Bitcoin, Web 3.0, I think Bitcoin is quite different from the other cryptocurrencies. I mean, you have the Wild West of speculative markets and cryptocurrencies, and then you have Bitcoin. And the real conversation would be between Bitcoin and Ethereum, as I understand it. But basically, Bitcoin would say, we're going to remove the possibility of dominating the world or being the leader of the world in terms of currency. And we're going to just take that off the table because it's too unfair. And in fact, if you want to be the dominant nation, then you're just going to have to have the most attractive culture. It's one of the reasons why I actually approve of the Web 3.0 thinking, because right now dominance is purely in terms, it's not even economics, like it's currency. It's like who controls the currency, and it is interesting that more and more nations are starting to trade oil off of the dollar. That's going to change that could be a big deal, because the dollar is so powerful because of all petroleum transactions have to be in dollars. Well, then even if you don't like the dollar, you need the dollar to get energy. And energy is by far the most energy use and GDP growth correlate greater than any other correlation, just about. Like the amount of energy a nation uses is extremely tied to how economically dominant it is, right? And that's actually part of the problem. Like when people are talking about alternative energy, they don't always realize, I'm not saying everyone, but there was that guy that our wonderful friend Tim Adlin spoke with who was really smart on this. But a lot of people don't understand that alternative energy is a unbelievably big deal because of the correlation between energy use and GDP growth. And if all, petroleum purchases have to be in dollars, well, then guess what? The dollar is really powerful and the financial system is strong. And if everyone's dependent on the dollar, then everyone basically is forced to buy US bonds, treasury bond market. And if the bond market is strong, well, then no matter how much money America prints out of thin air, or no matter how irresponsible it is in its financial sector, it doesn't matter because the dollar itself is too big to fail. And there's a paper in the second that's going to talk about the global debt bubble. And you have people like Benjamin Graham, I think he's been talking a lot about the super bubble, and different people are coming on to this thought. And it is very important. Basically, America is dominant because it has the global debt bubble of the dollar in its favor, right? And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, I would argue it's a bad thing because there's no competition. Like that in the same way that intellectuals don't have to have competition in universities because they have a monopoly, America does not have to create a culture that makes everyone want to be like, because you force everyone to be like you simply because you have to use the dollar. It's similar to like Christians saying, well, if you're not Christian, you go to hell. That means Christians don't have to be beautiful. Like if you can't tell people you're going to go to hell unless you're Christian, then it's your responsibility to attract them into Christianity, right? And how do you do that, right? Well, you have to be beautiful. Likewise, a reason why it will probably be very advantageous to move to a different currency system is because then if nations want to be the best, there's really only one way to do it. You have to offer an attractive culture. You have to make the best music, have the best thought, the best character, the best kinds of people, the best cities. It forces creativity to be central. And I do fear that basically the financial markets have replaced the emphasis on creativity in America. And I do agree with people like Tyler Cohn, the economist, who talks about the great stagnation. I do think it is true that American technological innovation has been very stagnant. You can talk about freaking Facebook and AI all you want, but the technological innovation has been remarkably concentrated in a few areas. And Tyler Cohn says things like that. Well, makes sense. If we don't have to do anything in those areas, because we can just dominate financially, it's no different than academics not thinking sex. They don't have to think sex. They can just think their theory. They're not forced by market forces to think sex in economics, so they don't. Likewise, the economy as a whole just thinks the financial sector, because creating a faster airplane is effing difficult. Creating a new algorithm for the bond market or for derivatives is not so difficult. I just need an AI, right? So that's really gotten America in trouble. My vision would basically be kind of cultural competition in terms of attraction. So the Middle East has the best. You think the Middle East is the best? Well, then they need to create the best and most attractive culture, the best thinking, the best philosophy, the best arts, the best cities, and so on. And then people will go there. And actually being Deleuzian in that sense would be good because you're able to like overcome the fear of leaving home, and maybe you can go to another nation and create roots there because they have a better culture. So that's a role where the nomad is important, right? Because it creates the ability of people to move between. cultures and different things. But for me, because America has been stuck in culture wars, it has believed that it has thought cultures by thinking the difference between, pro-life and pro-choice, for example, right? Oh, we're doing culture because we're thinking about the culture war. No, that's not thinking culture. You're not culture making. What we need to do is engage in culture making, which again, America hasn't had to do to prove itself as worthy of being the great influence because we've had the financial sector. Thinking in culture making would require you to think the contradiction. If you want to make culture, then you have to think sex and you have to think economics. And so the culture wars, by getting lost in them because we've lost dialectical thinking, has resulted in an emphasis on culture war versus culture making. And as a result, you can't have culture competition to have a fairer competition between nations to determine who should have the influence and who should not. And if everyone was influenced by America because the culture was the most beautiful, well, that wouldn't feel so oppressive because you're attracted into it, right? But when everyone is stuck under the dollar, then that feels oppressive, right? So the culture war has gotten in the way of the culture making. Now, one of the reasons culture war has gotten in the way of culture making is because we don't have the philosophical training to think how people could have different metaphysical worldviews and there be difference and that not mean our worldview is wrong. Well, this is why Hegel, Hume, and the counter freaking Enlightenment is everything. They're so big because they allow you to exist in a world where people have different metaphysical frameworks by which they understand sexuality, and it does not automatically mean that you are wrong in your metaphysical framework or that you need to fight them, right? Now, this will also get us into law. There's a paper on second thoughts on the Supreme Court because we have to think about the amendment process in America, and there are all of these other issues. But the key move that has to happen is autonomous rationality basically dooms you to always be in culture wars, because you always are stuck in a rationality that frames the other side of the war as necessarily wrong, because there's only one rationality, and that's your rationality, and they don't have it. So you're actually doing them a service to correct them out of their worldview into yours, right? Well, now we can't get into culture making because we're always going to be in culture wars. So this is part of the stakes of the movement from, say, Hume to Hegel and the counter Enlightenment in general. But all of that can only occur. But for all of that to occur, this does get us to the issue of the global reserve currency, the financial system, and thus we need to think that, and thus we need to go about what that would look like.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. It's certainly whenever we come to fundamental issues in economy, and I would also say sexuality, it tends to undo our representations. It undoes the representations of what we think is the correct orientation. One of the things you like there one of the things you said there that I really like is the dynamic you expressed as a Christian, being how do you attract people into Christianity without the threat of hell? Well, you need to be beautiful.
Right.
And one of the ways, I've been reflecting on, as you know, the end of the science of logic is you don't just have the unity of the theoretical and the practical between the true and the good, but you also have the very motion of the idea, or the very method of the becoming of the concept, which strikes me as something very beautiful. But that beauty comes at a very specific cost, which is confrontation or inclusion of absolute negativity. So the connection there that I'm trying to make is that it's almost like you have to include hell, or you have to include the devil, not as an external threat, but as inside yourself. And that seems to me to point towards some very interesting things you say towards the end of the book, towards the end of part 2 of the book, where you're talking about how Christians have to take Hegel and Deleuze seriously. And that, now this is one of the most interesting things I thought, is that you say, specifically in regards to what it means to be like Jesus, you say that it's closer to what Jesus intended. And I'd just like you to expand on that a little bit about what you mean by that. And also that it also points towards one of the next things you say, which is that it could lead to a society of aliens who progress through negativity. And that to me is very interesting to think about beauty on the level of the notion as such. So on the one hand, we have to unify the true and the good, and that would be the academics have to make their models practical. But then in order for them to be beautiful as individuals, that would be to be inspiring towards more, whether we say like Jesus or like Deleuze and Hegelians, whether that's whatever words we use, right? The Deleuze individual, the absolute knower, whatever, the Nietzschean child, there's many different symbols we can put on it. But what we're trying to get at, I think, is a beautiful motion of a being. So those are just some thoughts there that I think are, I guess, to connect it to what you previously said, essential for culture making.
Excellent. For me, as you know, I like to say the fate of beauty is the fate of us, because basically a society without beauty, even if it somehow is good and true, will not really care that much, nor will it be attracted to the good and true in a manner that would change it. You know, beauty is kind of the opposite of force, because force is when I make you like me. Beauty is when I attract you to me, and thus you change yourself as a subject in that very attraction. And basically, I don't think it's by chance that the death of beauty in culture has correlated with the rise of culture war. Roger Scruton was very good on that. But unfortunately, by coming from an overly conservative framework, Mr. Scruton and a lot of other conservatives who are right to, Russell Kirk will even say that conservatism at its very core is an aesthetic movement, which is pretty wild because people tend to associate art with liberalism and modern art and different things. But Russell Kirk would emphasize that conservatism, as soon as it ceased caring about the arts, was doomed. And I think that's correct, because the moment those social givens cease to feel like they give you access to some sort of beauty or mystery that is greater than yourself, that motivates you to live in a manner that is never complacent, well, then they're oppressive. And they're not, and they're just restricting you, right? And they're no good. And then the people on the outside who want to destroy them, there's no reason to even think the contradiction, because they're not even beautiful. So why would you care to even save them at all? But then if you get rid of them, you don't have belonging. Then you get the existential anxiety and so on and so forth. So making beauty central to this thought is really important. Jesus is so fascinating. You see, where American Christianity particularly has been in such disarray is to basically boil Jesus down to dying on a cross, saving you of your sins, and then you don't go to hell, right? Where Jesus, we always have to remember, Jesus, according to the paradigm of his day, is absolutely 100% a heretic. The Pharisees and Sadducees are completely correct. This guy just claimed he's God. That's his heretic. He's forgiving sins. Has he lost his mind? Like, we don't realize, like, because we're so comfortable as Americans with Jesus, we don't get how insanely radical he is. And we actually don't realize that the forces that crucify him are completely justified. Because he literally is breaking those laws. He literally is committing heresy, and he's literally adding to the Torah. That's about as bad as it gets, right? And yet, this very breaking through of God into history, of which is necessarily understood by those who love God as being anti-God, is precisely the moment that starts the unfurling of history in a new way according to the Holy Spirit. Right? So at the center of Christianity is contradiction in a very Hegelian sense. Like, and if you think about it, if God enters into history, almost by definition, he cannot be understood as God, because God is that of which is beyond history. So if he's in history, he can't be God, right? So the only way to know God in history is as not God, right? And going against everything you believe, right? Because you don't believe God can be in history. Of course you don't. And yet there he is, right? And so that blows everything up. And yet that blowing of everything up is a negativity that sublates a new possibility, right? But you see, what ends up happening is thinking of Jesus that way. There's no space of thinking of Jesus that way, because he just dies on the cross and you get saved. You don't have to worry about culture making, because you're pulled out of the culture, or it's indifferent to the culture, because this world, the principalities are evil. They're under the Lord of the air, which is the devil, according to Paul, so on and so forth. So Jesus being this force of radical negation, sublation, is missed. When you look at him as that, and then you say, I want to be like Jesus. Oh, you want to be a force of negation, sublation in the current historical moment that's going to be rejected and persecuted and not understood by the institutions of the day? That's what you want to do? Oh, well, that's a little different, right? Now, this is where Deleuzianism has a lot of truth to it, because Deleuzianism is indeed, Jesus is in a very real way, by definition, imperceptible, right? He is indeed opening up rhizomatic possibility, but he is doing it for the sake of the social order, not to escape the social order, but to recreate it, right? So it's the Deleuzian who stays situated in sex, in economics, in relation, in trying to build a church. Then Paul, frickin' Peter's going on and building a church, right? So how do you be Deleuzian while not forsaking institutions? How do you be a non-nomadic Deleuzian, basically? How do you be a non-nomadic? Now, you need to be nomadic to go off and learn the Deleuzian, but you have to come back and embed yourself, right? That's kind of what Jesus is kind of like putting out. There is something very Deleuzian about Jesus, but then he dies on the cross. Well, now we're talking something Hegelian, right? Because I think you're exactly right. I think you can fit Deleuze into Hegel, but the question is, can you fit Hegel into Deleuze? Now, this is a debate. I was having these wonderful net discussions with Teton, where there's resources in Deleuze. He has all the Hegelian, and the argument is that Hegel can't think radical repetition is the claim, but then of course Zizek says radical repetition doesn't exist. It's always sublation in disguise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can get into that gigantuous debate.
Just that's an important point, because I just want to make sure we get that right. Is one of the key chapters of Less Than Nothing is called The Limits of Hegel, and for Zizek, it's not that Hegel cannot think radical repetition. It's not that every repetition is sublation in disguise. It's that there's this transition to drive. So like there's this distinction between repetition and drive,
right?
Which Zizek makes in The Limits of Hegel. That every repetition is, I guess, a sublated idealization, and like you're saying, and that basically can't think drive.
No, I think that's exactly right. And
there's a big there's a lot there that might be something that we should.
But that's the stakes. But that's the stakes. Like, that's where you're putting your finger on it, and then you is that what's going on, right? That's to me, that's very compelling. That seems to be the case. But then, of course, because also we have the issue when we're talking about the Deleuzians now. I'm always going, am I talking about the people who claim to be Deleuzian acting popularly, but really in the depths of Deleuzian thought, there's addresses that avoid these downfalls or not? But then I'm like, but isn't that always a move that philosophers make, where they say, well, they're not, if they were true following my system, then they wouldn't make those mistakes or different things. I think the philosopher has to think that reality, right? Like, this is something Hume screams about. He's like, look, philosophers, you can't make a giant system that then somewhere in the depths of like level 9, year 9 of studying it, then you get the truth of it. You need to be literarily skilled enough to where the common person will basically be able to follow it without those unintended consequences, right? And that now people would shoot back. They were like, well, Hegel sure as heck didn't do that. Well, then we can debate that, right? But it's like, this is where the question becomes in Deleuze, if there's the emphasis on the line of flight, on the difference, on the lack of perceptibility, even if there's somehow a Spinozian, this is what I never understand. There's some sort of monism at play in Deleuze that is a manifestation of the rhizome, but I don't understand how they connect, right? Now, that could just be on me, right? And I'm not saying Deleuze doesn't have an answer to that, but then the question, I think, let's put it this way. If we're going to be intellectuals today, we cannot be people who say, oh, well, you didn't read enough of my system close enough, right? We need, I think the duty is kind of almost on us to be able to present the ideas that meet people in their phenomenological experience, that meet people in their lived experience, and not expect them to be masters of our complicated system. And look, maybe one of the reasons I always am hesitant in Deleuze, I have the internet. I have resources Deleuze didn't have. Likewise, Hegel had to write his books by freaking hand. That blows my mind. It blows my mind. But we today have resources. Like, I think it's extremely clear. I feel comfortable in saying that Deleuze misread Hegel. I think that's quite clear. However, I think historically speaking, misreading previous thinkers was more forgivable than it is now, because now we have the internet. And we have to understand, like, the game is changing. Like Harold Bloom talks about maps of misreading, anxiety of influence, where all of literary history is previous thinkers misreading other thinkers, right? Okay, but we can't do that anymore. And we don't really have a plausible excuse for doing that anymore, because we have the internet, because we can look up books, because we're able to access lectures so regularly. I think the bar has changed, and therefore it's also our responsibility to not expect people to read the utter depths of our thought. We need to be able to present it in a manner that people can get, meet in their phenomenology, not because we need to be digestible. This could sound like I'm saying we need to be capitalists that market ourselves in a sort of like simple. I'm not saying simplify. The big mistake is we've conflated clarity with simple. You can be complex and clear. Those are not the same things, actually. And I think it is extremely important to work toward clarity. And I'm not saying that means if the listener doesn't understand what you're saying, you're doing it wrong. But it does mean that if they genuinely want to understand, they can. That doesn't mean they, like everyone who listens will, but if they have a genuine heart, they ought to be able to get it. And I think it's our responsibility to do that. But no, I think the point that you're getting with Deleuze on the question of the role of the radical repetition versus what's going on in Hegel and the question of drive, I think that's all really, really good. And those do seem to be the stakes. And again, if you make drive the very nomadic life of the Deleuzian, and you integrate it into that, well, sure, that's going to deal with the sociological problem, but you have to give up roots to do that. And that's not what Jesus does, basically. Jesus centers himself in the place where the roots have to grow a different plant. The roots, like the roots are there, but he's like, hey, I'm here. And actually these roots that you've got that you thought were going to grow like an oak tree, they actually have to give rise to a dogwood now. That's what I'm here to evolve to you. Oh, you were really invested in those roots giving you an oak tree and you're really angry about it? Sorry, you're going to have to learn to kind of overcome that and work on yourself as a subject to encounter and be okay with the new, even though it goes against all of your deepest held beliefs, right? That's the challenge. And that's really, really hard to do. But that, to me, is when you start talking about what exactly does Jesus model, it would be that. In the willingness to kind of bear the cross of not being understood in that and rejected by the pre-existing social order.
There's something really great that you say about the way you relate to the cross specifically, and that is not only it's essential to include in a culture this level of brutal humiliation and essential tragedy of being, but you also say that without the affirmation of the cross, our tomb might be empty, but not because we ascended, but because we had nothing to offer. So there's this way in which that I think that captures a very profound idea. And now just sort of bringing it to the conclusion of belonging again, you leave us kind of with this absolute choice, which I know is so crucial in your work and so central in your ideas, from your article in the Hegel anthology, that's central. And I think you conclude, I like focusing on the way people conclude their works. I think you conclude by saying, belonging again might be possible through the work and blood of our lives, which I think is a great way to end the text. Actually, it's a very Nietzschean way to end the text. And also that the middle way between what seems to be, one way is to frame the problem of the dialectic of givens and releases is the middle way between isolationism and social collectivism, which I think is an important path to walk, involves the importance of the child. So that to me is a nice center leaving point, or a nice center ending point of the belonging again, the explanation, where what we have to do is work with the blood of our lives, that belonging is at stake, and that the center or the telos of this working in blood of our lives involves the child, keeping us away from isolationism and social collectivism. So maybe if you could give some final thoughts on that ending and how it might connect to the address.
Marvelous, and I think it's very well put to put it on between these the ditch of isolationism and the ditch of social collectivity, and I think that is the great challenge. And basically, like there's so much apocalypse thought today, right? Like, you know, whether it be AI or World War III or so on and so forth, there's a sense of like, well, we can't figure it out, so we're done for, right? I would like to think not. I would like to think that there are possibilities, but again, that is the role of the intellectual to think those, as opposed to not, but thinking those would require the intellectual themselves as a subject, facing themselves as an intellectual and their own discomforts with certain subjects they don't want to think, because if they think those, it may open gaps in their systems or pre-existing ideas that are very painful, basically. And I think ultimately we have to ask ourselves, so one of the things, like again with Jesus, like Jesus is like, oh, you think you're a saint? Well, that's precisely when you're a sinner. There's always this kind of self-skepticism that's part of the system. Like, there's nothing wrong with sex. There's just something wrong with lust. And are you really so sure you're good at telling the difference between lust and love? You sure? There's nothing wrong with wanting to help people, but there's something wrong with getting an ego out of helping people. And are you really so sure that you're not getting an ego out of helping people? You say you're trying to help people, but really, are you so sure? And what Christianity brings with it is this constant skepticism of your own motives and self. And just as soon as you think you know yourself, that's when you're most in danger, right? If the highest angel could become Lucifer, who the frick do you think you are? And so if you take that seriously, basically the Christian is only Christ-like to the degree that every single day they are, you know, the sweat and blood of doing the work to make sure that they don't fall into that egotism or that self-certainty that masks itself as humility, but it's not humble at all. It just acts like it's humble, right? If you take that very seriously, then you always have to be willing to kill the thing that you spent your life on. You always have to be willing to be proved, to be shown wrong about something you thought was true. And you always have to be willing to put yourself in the place where it hurts. And you should always be skeptical of thinking that doesn't hurt. You should always be skeptical of ideas that make you more comfortable. Now, it doesn't follow that if you're more comfortable, it's necessarily wrong, but maybe it does. And that maybe, that uncertainty, is precisely something that can go a long way to setting you in the right direction to actually locate or to head in the direction of an address that's actually an address, as opposed to simply something that looks like an address so that you can get the praise of finding the address. Because that's always a temptation, to be someone who has found the solution so you can be seen as the person that's found the solution, right? Well, how do you avoid that egotism? How do you avoid that? Well, just as soon as you think you have, you might want to be careful. And so to constantly put yourself in the place of the difficulty, of the hardship, of the pain, can't guarantee that you won't slip into egotism, but it is a very good test, a very good check and balance. And in fact, if it could guarantee it, then that in of itself would be an end to the work, right? This is where we can see the impossibility of certainty being the necessary condition for the constant killing of the ego. Because if you could gain certainty, you could overcome the battle of fighting the ego, or you could protect the ego forever behind the wall of certainty, right? Uncertainty, which tends to be the source of the existential anxiety that defines our present moment, that makes totalitarianism appealing or isolationism appealing, thus those two temptations, the collective and the isolationist, because we want to get a feeling of certainty. And if we're alone and we're never encountering difference, we feel certain, even if we're not, but we can feel like we are. Likewise, in the collective, if everyone around us thinks like us, we feel certain. Avoiding those temptations is to stay into the place of uncertainty, which is precisely the condition in which you constantly challenge your ego. And so the curse then is negated and sublated into a daily practice of which you work on yourself as a subject so that you might, through that constant work of blood and tears, head yourself in the direction of the address that actually would be an address, as opposed to simply a trophy that you can put on a freaking shelf in your room that you can show people when they come over. Because look, I saved the world. I came up with this address. That's always the temptation. The temptation is to think the real. The call is to think the real. The temptation is to think the real in a manner that's not actually thinking the real. It's just performatively thinking the real. The actual call is to encounter the present moment, Owl of Nineveh, Hegel, and to think the real. and then we can work on the address. And then to work on the address, that would mean, what does it look like to think a pricing mechanism or economy that demands something of me that's going to be uncomfortable, but will efficiently allocate resources on, say, the digital space? That is a really big challenge because you only tend to have an ad model like Anthony will talk about. Therefore, you have market inefficiencies, right? Okay, now we're thinking that. You say, okay, well, what is the breakdown of law so that we have law for a legal framework that allows the free exchange between people, so that people who believe in traditional marriage and people that believe in LGBT marriage can feel like they've all been given a process to justly live together and yet maintain their difference without feeling oppressed by the other. Now we're in the legal question. Well, guess what? The answer to that is going to be something uncomfortable. Every single way that you work on the system must increase basically uncertainty, which seems to be the exact opposite of the address, because isn't the problem uncertainty? No, the problem is not seeing uncertainty as what opens you up to working on yourself constantly as the subject. Once you see uncertainty as the necessary condition to force yourself to become a Nietzschean child, because basically you won't become a Nietzschean child if you have ways to avoid it, right? And one of the ways you avoid it is the individual or the collective. That also provide means of plausible deniability that you are avoiding becoming a child in those things, because it's just the truth. The collective is the truth. The isolationism is the truth, right? No, they're in service of ideology. They're in service of you avoiding the work of the child. But once you see uncertainty as what you require to hang around your neck like a law, precisely to force yourself through the work to become the child, then you say, yes, how do we make an economic system that increases uncertainty in a manner that is sublative, that is constructive, that is creative? How do we work on the legal framework in a way that doesn't let corporations hide behind law from being innovative, but actually forces them to be always susceptible to market forces to continue to be creative so we can avoid stagnation? How do we think about democratic processes to be substantive, as opposed to how do I vote once every 4 years to get my guy in power and then do the work for me against those evil liberals or whatever? No, how do you make the democratic process something that demands something of you to integrate with otherness as opposed to avoiding otherness? And then how do we break the college monopoly on credentials to start making institutions prove that they're worth something, as opposed to only having worth because they get you a job you otherwise could not have? All of these then are on the table for the question of address, which is ultimately the question of how to bring ourselves to the place where we face the uncertainty that we need to bring ourselves to the place of being that Nietzschean child, that absolute knower that we all need to be, so that we can see realistic alternatives to, say, Dugan, isolationism, or things of that nature.
Fantastic, Daniel. Well, I want to just thank you so much for coming on to have this conversation. It's an honor to have you on to discuss your work. I think that, in terms of what I'm taking away from Belonging Again is, the importance of understanding the dialectic on the level of society and global culture. And that if you're really willing to think the dialectic on the level of society and global culture, you realize that the task of thinking is really never over, that there are so many intractable issues, there are so many tension points, which are going to keep us busy for the rest of our lives, which is, on the one hand, a fantastic thing. But also, I think that your book is clearly something which reflects and is rooted in your own life, and rooted in a concrete thinking path which you have been developing for 5 years and that or more, and that shows. And I appreciate that aspect of the work, and I'm certainly looking forward to the address. So I know there's a whole second part of it. I know that the journey is still ongoing, and it's been a pleasure to discuss anyway the first half of it. So thank you very much. Is there any last thing you'd like to leave viewers with? Of course, I will of course leave links in the description to your work. So if anyone wants to read Belonging Again, there will be links in the description, and I highly recommend picking it up. But any last thing you would like to leave the viewers with?
Well, Cadell, I always really enjoy speaking with you. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for reading the book. Thank you for your support of the project. You have been a massive influence influence on so many different areas. And I'm grateful for that. And I hope people enjoy it. I hope people feel as if it provides an explanation that frames the moment so that we can think the now and not run from the real. And we will continue to work forward on the address. Indeed, there are many intractable problems. In a funny way, the very fact that there are intractable problems precisely means there's always a space for further dance, further development of beauty. And if you could solve every single problem, you'd eventually be left with nothing. And so the hope is that we can start to see intractable problems as precisely the best of all possible problems, because that means there's always a dance floor for that Trinitarian dance, that love that moves the sun and other stars, as Dante likes to put it. And precisely that we do have a work of our lives. Because when we don't have a work of our lives start to feel a little less alive. And it's good to have the work of our lives, because just as soon as that's gone, we fall into egotism. We fall into complacency. We fall into assumptions about how relationships should go that cause pathologies and problems. And the question is simply, what does it mean to make a society that is glad it has intractable problems, that sees those as an opportunity for a negation sublation to a better kind of society and a better kind of world that's precisely better because it's not utopian? If it was utopian, it would be worse for it. It's precisely the impossibility of utopia that is the opportunity for the world to be a place of a constant dance that is better and better and better for that dance, because it becomes better at being human, not overcoming the problems of human, but seeing those very problems of being human as the conditions of being human that make it wonderful to be alive. And so I would encourage us all to start seeing the problems of being human as precisely the precondition that can make life wonderful to live.
All right. Well, we'll leave it with that. Thank you so much again, Daniel. And for everyone watching, I hope you have a great evening.